And in the spirit of our past chair, I'd like to ask Mr. Dwyer, the newly elected chair of the Board of Ed, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And then, as our first order of business, we need to elect a chair. Are there any nominations? Mr. Bolito.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tetreault. At this time, I would like to nominate Mr. Tom Flynn for the office of Chairman of the Board of Finance. I think the best endorsement I can give Tom is the fact that he has navigated this board through some extraordinarily difficult times. When you think of the fact that in the past couple of years we've had 2 hurricanes, the lingering recession, Madoff, Metro Center, pension, union contracts, PCBs, school building projects, go right on down the line. We've had a lot to deal with, and through it all, Mr. Flynn has been a steady hand and kept this board on task and on focus. It's not easy to be the chairman of the board during the best of circumstances, and the fact that Tom has got us through some tough times and made us all feel like we had something to contribute, always let us speak our minds, and yet when it came time to make a decision, found a way to bring us all together to work toward a common goal. That's not an easy thing to do, and he's done it quite well. You also consider the fact that we've had an unusually high rate of turnover in some of our elected boards in recent years, including this one. So through it all, he's been a steady captain in a sea of change. So I would like to nominate my colleague and my friend Tom Flynn for the office of Chairman of the Board of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Bolito. Is there a second? Mr. Stone?
I'd like to second the nomination for, excuse me, for Mr. Flynn. I've been on the board, this will be my 6th year, I guess, and Tom, throughout it all, has been so fair to both sides. I really appreciate it. And I think he's, as Rob said, guided us very well. I've never had, I just think he's a wonderful chairman, and I think he deserves to be chairman again.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, any further discussion? Are we ready to vote?
Yes.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. Any opposed? Any abstentions? You abstain. Please note that Mr. Flynn abstained. Congratulations, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
And with that, I am turning the meeting over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Tetreault, and thanks to both gentlemen for their kind words. I'll have a few other comments to make a little later in the meeting, but before that, I think we should get to the task of filling out the leadership slate, and I'd like to open the floor to nominations for vice chairman. I think I will take the opportunity to nominate my colleague and friend and actual partner for the last several years, Rob Bolito, to be our vice chairman for the next term. Well, Rob runs a much faster meeting than I do and never hesitates to point that out. He is also behind the scenes very active with me, providing counsel and assisting me in how we communicate things and how this board functions. And I greatly value his opinion, his guidance, his fairness, his openness, and his point of view. And one of the nice things about this board is that we all come from different backgrounds. Rob's background not being purely financial but more from the legal realm brings a very unique and much needed viewpoint to our deliberations. So I'd like to nominate Rob to continue as vice chair. And do we have a second to that nomination? Mr. Walsh?
Yes, I'm honored to be able to second Rob's nomination. I've known Rob for many years. We were able to work on this board for a short time, but prior to even starting my work on this board, I was able to come to this board as a member of the Board of Selectmen and was able to watch Rob in action when Tom was unable to make a meeting here and there for some business reasons and being out of state and stuff like that. And I think the true test of a chairman, because sometimes you're not called on for a while, is how you pick up the ball once the chairman is unable to be there. And in my experience, Rob never missed a beat. He was able to run the meeting just like Tom was able to run the meeting, and had the respect of this board at all points in time, and was able to run a very efficient meeting, as he points out sometimes, which is not good for some of us who like to talk, like myself, but he was able to keep us on task, and he was always very versed on all of the issues before us, and was very fair. So I can't think of another better person to follow Tom if Tom's unable to be here than Rob, and I think that's the true test of a vice chairman. So I would put his name in, second it for nomination.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Are there any other nominations at this point? Seeing none, are we all set to vote? All in favor of Rob Bolito as vice chairman for the next term? Those opposed? Abstentions? All right, Rob, congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Look forward to working with you.
Me too.
All right, the office of secretary is now before us. Do we have a nomination for secretary? Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I would like to nominate James B. Brown, otherwise known as Jim, for the office of secretary. Chris DeWitt did an excellent job as our secretary, and for various reasons, not the least of which he's going for his MBA, he decided to step down from that role, and frankly, Jim was one of the first people I thought of for the role. I think he will do an excellent job. He has been a stalwart member of this board since he's been on it. He always asks very good questions, is always engaged, and knows what he's talking about, and also brings a lot of his business background to the fore. Again, it's one of the things that's great about this board is that everybody has their own unique experiences and talents, and I think that Jim's experience in the business world will serve the board well in the position of secretary, and also his attention to detail will help with that punch list that we're going to be doing again. So I am proud to endorse my friend Jim Brown for the office of secretary.
Thanks. Do we have a second? All right, I will second Jim's nomination. The godfather of finance, as I like to call him, has been a unique and very good addition to this board over the past few years. I liken him to the old E.F. Hutton commercials, where he's very quiet, but when he talks, people listen. He's our secret weapon in many of our deliberations, and while he'll be quiet for a long period of time, he'll come up with just the comment to succinctly wrap up many of our deliberations. And I'm sure he'll do an excellent job as our secretary, and more importantly, keeping me on task with our follow-up items. So I would second Jim's nomination. At this point, are there any other nominations for secretary right now? Okay. Seeing none, are we ready to vote? Yes. Good. Okay, all in favor of Jim Brown to be our secretary? Those opposed? Abstentions? Okay, Jim abstains. And congratulations, Jim. Thank you. We look forward to working with you. All right. And with that, we have our full slate of officers for the next coming year. Mrs. Albin, would now be appropriate? I think Mrs. Albin asked for absolutely not, an opportunity to speak, so feel free.
Thank you. First, I'd like to start off by congratulating Tom, Bob, and Jim. I think you will all do a fine job, and I thank you for your willingness to do the extra work. Having sat in some of those positions myself multiple times on a different board, but it is a lot of work, while yours may be different than that was. I was pleased to vote for all of you, but this process, given my experience elsewhere, caused me reason to pause. And with that, I first would like to note that as a newly appointed board member, I certainly have no interest in one of these positions, nor would I think it would be appropriate for me to serve in them such a short tenure. So these are not comments I make with any personal interest, but they are for the betterment of this board. And during my 12 years on the Board of Education, our leadership was a bipartisan leadership. And that was the case for as long as I was there. Before I was there, whenever possible, there was bipartisan leadership. I served with I as a Democrat served with a Republican chairman, I being the vice chairman. I as chairman had a Republican vice chairman. We worked very well together, and I also think that it strengthened the board in many ways that may or may not have been apparent to the public. And I think that given the gridlock that we all see in Washington, and I believe all dislike, I applaud the model that the Board of Education has had in selecting leaders, the effort that they've made. I applaud the model that the RTM has with bipartisan leadership as well. And I would hope to see this board endeavor to follow those two models next year and going forward, and make a sincere effort, where possible, to have a team of bipartisan leadership. Thank you.
Sure. Does anybody have a comment? We'll go to Mr. Stone and then Mr. Walsh.
I just want to echo what Kathy said, and that's no disrespect to any of you. It's just that, you know, there should be some, we've gotten along terrific. I mean, this is probably the best working board in the town, if you want my opinion. But I think there comes a time when the minority party needs to be able to step up to the plate, too. So I would just hope, I mean, I voted for all of you. I have nothing against any of you. You're great. But I think next year, you should consider, I mean, we don't know who, maybe we're being the majority. You don't know. Maybe, yeah, that's a good thought. So let's just keep that in mind, okay?
Sure. Mr. Walsh.
Well, I hear what you both say. I mean, first of all, I guess I don't take issue with it. I understand it, but just to do it, I don't think is always the best thing. Sometimes I think it's best to have the best people in the positions, and that it should be the best qualified people. And I think the point to the Board of Education board, which, not to take slice, but has not been the model of the best board that we should all model ourselves on, with the infighting that's gone on there. This board has worked well for a number of years. It's been probably one of the best boards in town, and was one of the reasons I welcomed the opportunity to be on it after leaving the Board of Selectmen. Because I don't feel as though there's politics on this board at all, by anybody who's on here, at all. I think you both agreed, and I think the rest of us agreed, that the current leadership has done a phenomenal job, and we've all wanted to stay with it. So to talk about making changes, and especially modeling after the Board of Education, I think is misplaced. If you want to take another model, we'll look at it, but that's not the model that I'm looking at in regards to trying to change this board to. I'm more of a, if it's not broken, why try to fix it kind of person. So while I hear what you want to say, and I'll consider in the future, I don't agree with it at this point. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right. Thank you for the comments. At this point, before I go on to our schedule, I just want to take a moment of personal privilege and thank my colleagues on the Board of Finance for their vote and their continued trust to be your chairman. I have not found this to be difficult work from the standpoint of we all get along so well. This board has been filled with very smart people for the 7 years that I've been on it, who have all put politics aside and worked for the betterment of the town. And running the meetings have actually been a real pleasure, to listen to the different points of view, to see how everyone approaches issues different way, and to work with all of you. So to be your chairman and run the meetings hasn't been difficult. The behind-the-scenes work, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of communication that goes on, and there's a lot of coordination, a lot of work with the town clerk. But the actual meetings themselves, we get a lot of compliments about how the meetings function. And quite frankly, that goes to all the board members who get along so well. And so I thank you for that. We have a good board, smart, hardworking, friendly, easy to get along with, and we're going to confront some major challenges in the next year. We're going to have another budget, a budget that comes within an election cycle, no less, a local election cycle. As you can see in our reports, there's some rather large liabilities on the pension side that we're going to have to deal with that are going to put added pressure on our spending. We still have a number of union contracts that are outstanding that we're going to have to find some way to fund. We have the PCB issue which we're going to hear about this evening. We have a capital planning workshop, and we have the effects of the hurricane on our town. Add that all in with, we've got to appoint a permanent clerk to the Board of Finance, and we've got our work cut out for us in the coming year. So I look forward to working with all of you, and I look forward to working with the other town bodies, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Dwyer once again and congratulate him on his election as the chairman of the Board of Education. And we look forward to working with him and his colleagues, as well as the RTM, to make sure that we address these issues head-on, along with the Board of Selectmen. So thank you for your confidence, thank you for your vote, and I look forward to working well another year. Any other comments? Does anybody have anything to say? Jim, Rob? No. All right, so if that's it, let's move on to the approval of the 2013 schedule, which is item number 2 on the agenda. Now, we'd like to, I think, Mrs. Bossy and I would like to thank Mr. Hiller, who helped us with this schedule to model it off of what we've done in prior years. I did want to point out a couple of items here to discuss. Number one, we did try to fit in the capital planning workshop from the current fiscal year, or rather the current calendar year, that had been delayed multiple times, first at request of the administration and then by the hurricane. That's scheduled for January 17th per this schedule. We were informed today that there's a conflict with the first selectman on this meeting, with his office. So we did get some other dates. Mr. Dwyer, I don't know if you have your calendar with you, and we can throw a couple of dates out there if everyone has their calendars we can look at. So, Caitlin, feel free to just throw out a couple of the items that we have. Do you have that?
Do you want to start with the first, the long-term capital?
Yes, exactly. Let's just look at that. What alternative dates did the first selectman give us?
Well, he gave us the 22nd, which I actually do have the Board of Ed. There's a lot of budget, and there's a lot of times that they're using this room in January, so we can either choose another location or
Okay.
another day. The first one they threw out was this 22nd. 24th, they have this room, and again, budget.
Okay,
29th, they have this room, again, budget.
okay,
Wednesday, January 30th, but we had that as our quarterly meeting.
yep, and we're going to keep that.
And the last date that was thrown out there was January 31st,
Okay,
which is a Thursday, which might be doable.
yeah, 2 nights in a row does not sound great to us. All right, so, and those are the only dates we have, correct,
Those are
from
the
the
only
first
dates
selectman?
that were thrown out there by the
Right.
First Selectman's office.
Okay, and we got those at about 4 o'clock this afternoon, as I recall. Okay, so what I'm going to ask is, can we pull this item off this schedule and try to re-coordinate with the other boards on this? Okay, so for the calendar that's in front of us, can I make a motion that we remove the January 17th Thursday capital planning workshop, and that we will schedule this separately as a special meeting? Do I have a second to that? Seconded by Mr. Bolito. Any discussion on that motion? Yeah.
We still have the January 8th.
We will still have the January 8th meeting, correct. This is just the 17th, which was trying to reschedule the capital planning workshop once again. Does anybody have any questions, comments?
This is capital planning workshop we've been delaying since basically August,
September.
September.
Yep,
We're almost getting to the point where it's not even going to make sense, because we have basically 28 days in February
Yep.
to have this before budget season kicks off.
yes,
I mean, it's starting to look like we're not even going to have it. I mean,
Uh,
it's starting to become a real concern.
yes.
So if we can't agree on a date soon, let's just blow the thing up. I mean, it's just, and realize that it's not going to be able to work. I
Yep.
mean, it's just, I mean, every time we propose dates, it just doesn't work.
Let me get together with the first selectman after this evening.
Yeah, because it's,
Because this had been on here again. We just got notified at 4 o'clock this afternoon.
I know.
So,
it's
okay.
ridiculous.
Ms. Leclerc?
I was wondering if I could make a suggestion. Since the 17th doesn't work for the First Selectman's office, could we swap it with another meeting date?
Perhaps, okay, what would you prefer, maybe moving our quarterly review up to the 17th and moving the Capital Planning Workshop to the
Well,
30th?
that one, we seem to push back to make the timing
I know.
work. But maybe our regular meeting or one of the budget meetings?
Okay, so could we move our regular meeting to the 17th and have the Capital Planning Workshop meeting on the 8th?
It would be.
It's not a bad thought. Mr. Tetro?
As long as I'm not involved in the, or you don't need me for an agenda item on at the regular meeting?
It would be up to your office. I don't know what's going to be on that agenda. I don't know what you're sending our way. The Board of Education, do you have something?
The ones that you're talking about, we have our board meetings for the budget, but we also have RTM committee meetings that frequently
Yep.
require board attendance, so January, pick a date and it'll be wrong.
Yeah, right, exactly. Why don't we pull it off the calendar now and see if we can arrange it separately?
Just thought.
But thank you. No, thank you. Does anybody have any other questions? Yeah, Mr. Stone?
I don't mind pulling it off the calendar, but I definitely want to do it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Stone. Anybody else? All right. With that, any questions, comments from the public? Seeing none. All in favor of the motion to pull the January 17th Capital Planning Workshop off the schedule and to revisit it to a different date after coordination with the First Selectman's Office and the Board of Education. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, we're going to move that item. Now, the rest of the calendar is before us as amended. There was one question regarding, Mrs. Leclerc, did you have a question you wanted to raise on the 7 o'clock start?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to discuss it a little bit. I just have a very hard time making it here in time for 7 o'clock. So I know we want to get out at a reasonable hour, and I understand that. So I just was wondering if it's hard for anyone else, or if it's good for everyone, then I'll just leave it.
Okay, so Mary is specific, or Mrs. Leclerc is specifically referring to the budget sessions. You'll notice that all our regular meetings start at 7:30, with the exception of the organizational meeting, which is this same meeting next year, and our budget hearings, which several years ago now, Mr. Bolito?
Yes.
We moved till 7 p.m. due to the length of some of those meetings. Actually, I don't remember it being as bad last budget cycle, so.
No, it wasn't, Mr. Chairman. I think we have enough dates that with some creative scheduling that we might be able to not have log jams on one particular night, and we could potentially move it to a 7:30 start time to allow everyone the opportunity to get here on time from work. It's just a matter of working with the budget subcommittee to figure out how the different departments slot into these dates, but I think it can be done.
Thank you. Mr. Stone?
I'm in favor of keeping it at 7 o'clock.
Okay.
Because I think we had I'm not too optimistic about this budget year. So I think we're going to be talking a lot, and I think every half hour that we have is going to be valuable. And, I don't want to go to 1 in the morning or something
Right.
either.
Right.
And we discussed it at the budget subcommittee for, this is the reason why we specifically made it at 7.
Right.
So I understand Ms. Leclerc's problem, but even if she got here a little bit later, I think it's all right too, as long as most of us are here.
Okay, Mr. Bolito?
What about splitting the difference, going to 7:15? Would that help you?
I guess, but would that be more confusing on
Yeah.
people?
Probably.
I think it's
Yeah.
So
not
I
confusing
think
for the public.
it's okay to leave it at 7.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to leave it at 7? Okay. All right, any other questions, comments, concerns on the schedule? Seeing none, any questions, comments from the public on the schedule? Okay, back to the board. Do I have a motion to accept? Mr. Polito, do I have a second to move this? Mr. Stone? All in favor of the schedule? Those opposed? Abstentions? Congratulations, everybody. With that exception of the capital planning workshop, we have a schedule. With that, can I have a motion to adjourn? Can I go with Mr. Stone, a second by Mr. Walsh? All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Abstentions? Okay, we are adjourned for a couple seconds. Let's take just, can we do 5 minutes here? And then we'll re-adjourn. Or, yeah. estimated a rate of return, Mr. Mayor, last year of 7.75%, I believe it was, and that rate of return actually came down substantially. Right, well, no, I mean, the actual results for that fiscal year, I think were under 1% in the returns. So we were all concerned over what the impact on the pension contribution, the actuarial study would be. We have some additional information on that. And then we wanted to, this is an item number 5 from the prior meeting as well, to review some requested follow-up documents to make sure we're staying on point. Mr. Brown, that's going to be something for the Secretary going forward. And then the last item is to hear, consider, and act upon any other communications. Any questions from board members on the agenda? Comments, concerns? Anything? All right, seeing none. First item, to approve the minutes of the special meeting of the Board of Finance from November 13th, 2012. Any questions, comments on those minutes? Seeing none from board members, I'll go to the public. Any questions, comments from the public? All right, back to the board. Do I have a motion on this? Mr. Bolito, do I have a second? I'm going to go with Mr. Stone. All in favor of accepting the minutes? Those opposed? Abstentions? Mrs. Albin, did you vote? You're in favor? Okay. So there was one abstention and everyone else voted in the affirmative, although late. All right. Item number 2. This is not a voting item, but it's to hear a presentation on the PCB matters confronting the school system from Woodward and Curran. Dr. Teitel, can I ask you to come up and just introduce your guests and give us a little color, if you don't mind?
Color. Come on up. Well, you guys, they're going to take the seats. I'll just. Right, here we go.
You're not getting that off that easy.
That's
You're
all
just-
That's fine. I'll let the guests give the background on themselves, but, you know, we've been here several times talking about the Osborne Hill PCBs and the cost to the school system this year with the budget and potentially longer-term capital costs at that facility that are still undetermined. And the question was raised almost immediately, you know, over the summer as we were dealing with this from members of the public, obviously concerned about what's the status in our other schools, do we need to be concerned, what action should we take? And I think we all realized that we really needed to get some expert guidance on this, that there was potential, you know, a lot of potential here for this to go in a number of different directions. And so the Board of Ed, Mr. Cullen, his staff, put out some proposals, and a firm of Woodward and Curran was chosen to conduct the study to get to launch this. But we see this as a partnership. It's a town-wide issue. It's not just a school system issue. And they've been to the Board of Ed last week. They're on the schedule for the RTM at the end of the month. So let them describe what their game plan is, the background on the whole issue, and then answer questions. At this point, there's no results to bring to you, but to sort of get everybody on the same page with this and move ahead. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Tyler. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm still here. We'll find you. Right here.
So my name is Jeff Hamill. I'm a principal at Woodward and Curran. Next to me is Lisa Camp. She's also a principal in the firm. A little bit about Woodward and Curran. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but we're a 650-person firm. Our 2 offices closest to Fairfield are in White Plains and Cheshire, Connecticut. And we do a wide range of engineering, environmental consultant services. What Lisa and I do in the firm, we kind of refer to as corrective action, remediation, risk assessment, so of contaminated materials and things. But the firm does water engineering, wastewater engineering, compliance, the full range. And at the Board of Ed, we had a handout that had a profile of the firm and some other things that we don't need to go into detail. So like I said, my focus has been on corrective action, site assessment. I've been doing that for about 25 years now, just solely focusing and cleaning up sites. Lisa has a similar level of experience, but her focus has been in human health risk assessment. So she takes it to where we're doing the cleanup, she's understanding the risk to occupants of our buildings. With regard to PCBs, a lot of us hear about PCBs and think about electrical transformers, General Electric, the Hudson River, sediments, things of that nature where it was put into electrical and oils. But it was also used a lot in building materials as a plasticizer. So it had a wide range of use in sealants, paints, fire retardant applications, very common building materials that were sold legally, put on by contractors, and they find themselves in the buildings right now. So it's not like a chemical that has an illegal release or something. It was purchased and put in, and it's still intending its use. PCBs had a relatively short lifespan, created in the 30s, banned in the 1970s. So you can't buy them, you can't produce them anymore, but they're still in some buildings. But in that very short lifespan, from an industry standpoint, they had massive use in a lot of different products, and we find them everywhere, pretty much. There's studies out there of samples done of ice samples in the polar ice cap, and they find PCBs in this material. A lot of us, if we had studies done, would find PCBs in our bodies just from eating fish and other things like that. So it's a pretty common contaminant that's around. So although it's common and had a wide use, there's not have been a lot of momentum or understanding of it in the building materials. And it really wasn't until 2004, through some studies done in Europe and in Boston, and a concerned citizen in Westchester County that published a lot of papers, or put a lot of papers on the website, that it started gaining momentum that PCBs are in building materials, especially in schools. And in 2009 was the first guidance that the EPA put out. So relatively new kind of standard of practice on how to deal with these things. And since 2009, EPA has put out different studies and guidance documents about that. The point I want to make with that is, it's 2012, it's really 3 years since some guidance. The regulated community and the regulators are still trying to figure out how to deal with this, how to look for it, how to test for it, how to fix it, how to remediate it. Those things are still kind of a work in progress. And an analogy to that is, could be asbestos, where asbestos came into light, a few years or many years ago, and it was a hazardous building material. There was an understanding of it. People figured out how to remediate it, and it's very common now. So it's still in building materials in many buildings that we're all in, but people understand it. They understand the potential risk for it, and when it needs to be removed and when it doesn't need to be removed. And we're hoping PCBs can get to that point as well, but it's just not there yet. We're still trying to figure out how to best do it. So when we look at PCBs, there's really two ways that we look at it. One is if there's a project that's going to disturb something that has PCBs. That could be a sealant around a window, and you're going to take the window out for an energy upgrade or something like that. So you want to look at that if there's PCBs in there for proper management, and that's a regulated thing. So there's a regulation out there of how to dispose of that material. It's not risk-based. It's just if it's over a certain concentration, the regulation says, dispose of it this way. If it's below that, you don't need to dispose of it that way. Based on a number, you take a sample, it's a number, you do the project. The other one is if I have PCBs, or I think I have PCBs, is it a risk to any of the building occupants? And that's different than the regulation, and the regulation doesn't specifically speak to that, and that's what some of the guidance that EPA has out speaks to that level of it. And unlike a concentration, when you look at it from a risk, it's about an exposure pathway. And the two main ones on buildings are if you touch it, it's called dermal contact, and you might put it up to your mouth or something like that, or as it come off the source and you touch it, or you breathe it, inhalation. And in 2009, EPA came out with some numbers that are risk-based numbers, they said. So if you have those exposure pathways, you can compare to these numbers. So different from the regulation, these are just guidance that they felt that they did some studies and they calculated these numbers, and that's what you can compare to some of these risk-based exposure pathways. So the two are different, and when we look at them, we look at them differently. Lisa has experience with the risk assessment, and she's going to talk a little bit about those numbers and how EPA developed those numbers to put some perspective to it. Then I'll come back and I'll finish up what we're going to try to do at the schools.
So, as Jeff was saying, risk is a function of, having some kind of hazard at some concentration, but it's also a function of exposure. So you can have, a chemical that's present at a very high concentration, but if it's, something that's not volatile and it's 10 feet below your floor slab and no one's contacting it and there's no potential for, inhalation, you're not going to have a risk. So you really, everyone needs to remember that risk is a function of both of those things, not only having some kind of hazardous chemical present at some concentration, but also exposure potential. And Jeff will talk about how the approach that we're proposing to use in your school district really factors both those items together so we can help you understand where your highest potential risk issues may be, where suspect materials might be located, and really build a matrix that's going to inform good, sound decision-making in the future. So I like numbers. I'm kind of the numbers person, and I think it sounds like you're very familiar with some of the air action levels based on the Osborne Hill School. And so to just put some of the air potential exposures in perspective, I think in the Q&A that hopefully most of you have seen, when you look at PCB exposures to people, by far the highest exposure potential typically comes from diet, especially from fish consumption. And if you look at the allowable levels of PCBs in fish, I mean that the FDA regulates, for example, it can be up to 2 milligrams per kilogram of fish. That's actually a pretty high number. I'm not saying that all your fish has that. That's an upper limit. But by far, the highest potential for exposure is through ingestion of products that have been impacted by PCBs. PCBs are everywhere. They're in sediments, they're in the ocean, they're in soils at various concentrations. So pretty much the highest exposure potential for people is typically through diet. Then also contact and incidental ingestion of soil and sediment. So if you're swimming or wading in a contaminated surface water body, PCBs have also been released to soils. Again, some of it's from degraded building materials, some of it is from old manufacturing facilities where they used to make capacitors, etc. And then on the lower end of the spectrum, you see indoor air inhalation exposures and surface water and drinking water. PCBs are really generally not in water. They are not soluble. They like to stick to dirt and sediment, and they like to go into fats in your body. That's why they're very persistent. That's why they're in fish, and they kind of go up the food chain. So, the very properties that made them, I think, people very fond of using them is their elasticity and their persistence, but those are also some of the traits that mean that they're around for quite a while. So that's just to give you a sort of a broad sense of the exposure potential. When you look at the numbers that EPA came up with for air, it's important to take into consideration that they were looking at a total dose that either children or workers in a school or teachers may be exposed to. So it wasn't just you're breathing air. It's also all the kinds of background and dietary exposures that I was just talking about. Those were taken into consideration too. So when they came up, for example, with that number of 300 nanograms per meter cubed of PCBs in air, which I think is the action level that they talked about, at the Osborne Hill School, that number actually translates into a very, very low potential for any kind of adverse effects. So you look at the potential cancer effects of PCBs, that 300 translates into about maybe 3 excess cancer cases above and beyond the background rate, which is about 1 in 40%. So the background cancer rate, just due to all the things we do, being in the sun, smoking, eating, charred food, etc., that's about somewhere between 1 in 2 and 1 in 3. That 300 nanograms per meter cubed is somewhere around 3 excess cancer cases per 10 million people exposed. And it's important to keep in mind, too, that the toxicity values that EPA comes up with, they're very, very conservative. The ones for PCBs are extrapolated primarily from animal studies, and then they look at the lowest adverse effect level in maybe a mouse study or rat study, and they're exposing these animals to extremely high concentrations, thousands to sometimes 1 million times higher than you would see with the kind of environmental exposures we're talking about. So, we're extrapolating from animals, we're exposing them to very, very high doses for almost, typically their whole lifetime, and then we're adding uncertainty factors to protect sensitive individuals, children, et cetera. So there's a lot of layers of conservatism that go into the whole risk process. So I just want everyone to start to feel more conversant and understand better that this 300 nanograms per meter cubed, if you're at 350, it doesn't mean that you have any kind of potential for some kind of acute health impact or that health impacts might occur at all. I just want, it's a very, very stringent threshold, certainly below which you would not anticipate any kind of adverse health effects, but you're talking about a very, very small risk. I'm not saying it's a risk not worth protecting, but it is very, very small in the face of things. So it's important to keep in mind and have a broader perspective on how those numbers came up and what they really mean. And if you're over by a nanogram, it's, or even sometimes maybe by up to a factor of, almost 10, which I think was the highest concentration in the gym at the Osborne Hill School, that doesn't mean that something shouldn't be done. But it's also just to lend you some concept of perspective of what those risks really might be. And it's also important to note that those numbers were assuming pretty much full-time, everyday exposure by school children. So for like school kids, it's 6 years, I think 180 days per year, 6.5 hours every day to those concentrations. So if that concentration's in a gym, like I said at the Board of Ed meeting, unless you're a really lucky kid and you're getting to spend your whole school day every day, Monday through Friday in the gym, that's only a small fraction of your exposure. So you need to take into account that you're in the library, that you're in a classroom, and these other places. So those are the kinds of things that will help take into account in the approach that we're recommending for going ahead in the school. So I think that's just to lend some perspective.
Is there any questions from board members, given the technical nature of the conversation so far? Anybody have any questions? Okay. Go ahead. Thanks.
So just to, so what are we going to do now? So what's our goal of our assignment that we're going to do is we're going to start the process of developing a program. So the school district already has programs for other hazardous materials, asbestos, lead-based paint, other things, and how to manage them when they're encountered. And we're going to start that process with the PCBs so we can get integrated into the long-term either capital plans or renovation plans, repair plans for buildings. As I said on that one of the first things to do is if you have a project and you impact it, that's one way to look at PCBs. How do I deal with this material when I impact it during the project? So this first part of our kind of assignment or our study, as Dr. Tittle said, is to collect some information. And what we're going to do is take the list of the schools, so there's 16 school buildings that we're working with, and start applying some, information data points or some screening criteria to those. The first one that we would look at would be construction date. So for an example, 3 of the 16 schools are built after the year 2000. That's 20-plus years after the ban of PCBs. There shouldn't be any PCBs in those schools, so they kind of go off the list. A lot of the schools that are currently still on the list have additions in the 2000s. So a lot of those areas of the school, should not have any PCB building materials in it. So those get looked at a little bit differently. So we look at the dates of construction to help us a little bit. Then we look at if there's any previous data to help us understand what's going on. And there's 5 schools where there's existing data already for PCBs. I think everyone's aware of the Osborne Hill data, but there's other schools. The Ludlow High School has caulking that was greater than 50, and this is on the website, but it also has indoor air samples that are not an issue. So they're below those levels that Lisa was talking about. The surface wipes, the dermal contact things are below those levels. So just because you have PCBs in a material doesn't necessarily mean there's an exposure pathway that we talked about that generates a risk. You can have it there, it can be intact and not be a risk, and we have, within this, in the town as well as many other towns where that is the case. The third piece that we'll look at will be a visual observation of the schools themselves, and we're looking at types of materials that we've seen in other places compared to what Osborne Hill data might say and just kind of start building out. We've seen this type over here, this paint over here, this spray, fire retardant in this area, and start kind of building it all together. There's other indicator parameters that we may take samples of. One is chlorine. If you think of PCB, it's a polychlorinated biphenyl, which means it has chlorine in it. So if you screen for chlorine and you don't find any chlorine, it's a good indicator that you don't have PCBs. So it's one of those things that we're going to collect all this information to help us develop this conceptual site model, and then use that to jumpstart into this management program as we go forward. But the first spot is collect the information, understand the buildings, and then take the next steps going there. So I think that's pretty much what we had for what we're going to do, and happy to answer any kind of questions that anybody may have.
Anybody? Mr. Belito?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for coming out and giving us a primer on this. Obviously, around here, we're kind of used to hearing about asbestos and lead paint and things like that, but PCBs is kind of new for a lot of us, so it's very helpful to have the background. What I wanted to ask about is causation, because one of the things that kind of struck me was that in your materials that were provided, it says that according to the American Cancer Society, half of all men and 1/3 of all women in the U.S. will develop cancer during their lifetime. This means that the estimated 2 additional cancers in 100,000 exposed persons at Osborne Hill would be in addition to the 33 to 50,000 background cancers that would be expected without any PCB exposure. How do we know that those 2 additional cancers are caused by PCBs, or do we know that?
We don't know that. It's a probability. So when we're talking about cancer risk estimates, it's a probability. So that doesn't mean that there are going to be 2 excess cancers
Right.
per 100,000. This is just going off the data and the toxicity models that EPA comes up with. And like I said, all the studies are based on exposures way up here, and we're extrapolating them down using, pharmacokinetic modeling and basically almost, guessing, like, okay, well, if you see this kind of effect at these really high concentrations, at these really low concentrations, we're going to see less of an effect. But frankly, we might not even see an effect at all. I mean, there's still a lot of questions about the causality and the modality of cancer and, initiation, promotion. No one's really sure exactly how it works. Or, and PCBs aren't even a known human carcinogen. They're a probable human carcinogen. But again, it's not like there's a few things like asbestos, arsenic. There are some things that we actually know have been shown to be cancer-causing in humans. We have people studies that, epidemiological data that show that. We don't have that at PCB. So, no, there's not necessarily causality. There might not be any adverse effects or cancers at the kind of low concentrations we're talking about, but that's just a conservative probability estimate.
Right.
That's all.
So conceivably speaking, if a kid eats a fish lunch a couple times a week, that could be triggering some sort of adverse health reaction as much as something being in the ceiling at the gym.
Absolutely.
And I guess that's one of the things we struggle with, is that at what point are you dealing with a known health risk and keeping our children safe, and at what point are you overreacting to a probability? And then you have the issue of what are you required to do by the EPA that's just not negotiable, but then what do we do going forward? Because obviously we have other school buildings in town that were built around the same time period, more than likely have similar or the same building materials in them. So with Osborne Hill, because we have the windows, it triggers EPA requirements. Those other schools where those projects are not going on, what do we do with those? And that's what we're really struggling with. And in terms of your action plan, what do you see in terms of how do you be proactive without overreacting? I guess is the way to put it.
I think your struggle is not unique to other communities, and I think a lot of people are trying to assess this. And EPA tried and came out with some guidance in 2009 to help answer these questions. And you're right, there's no regulation, so there's no requirement per statute or regulation that says you need to do this. The only one that's out there with PCBs and building materials are if you have a known concentration that you're wanting to dispose of, then if it's over a certain threshold, then you need to deal with it this way. But the evaluation of the safeness of a building, so to say, or is there a risk from my building, is one of these gray areas that I was talking about earlier of where we are in the standard of practice. Just this past year, EPA came out with 3 studies where their research, Research Triangle Park, were looking at, does PCBs volatilize off building materials? What happens if you coat it with an encapsulation? Does that solve the issue and things of that? And they're trying to understand those things to come up with a way to say, all right, if you find it and you coat it, you should be safe or not. But we're just not there yet. So what we're dealing with is looking at some of these levels that are out there, and EPA said if there's a concern in the school, look at the indoor air, and if the indoor air is below these levels, then that's okay. And there's a lot of issues with that, with going out and are those the right numbers? And Lisa talked to those a little bit, and you mentioned as well. Are they too low? Are they the right? Do they cause a risk or not? And what we've been able to do with other buildings is adjust those numbers a little bit and just say, let's really look at it for, who's in the rooms, what's their intended use, and really calculate a building-specific or occupant-specific number that we can compare to see if we really need to do something, about it. And a lot of times, just by either coating or removing, that does the trick a lot, or increasing ventilation, things of those natures that are sometimes best practices for the building can help solve the problem as well.
Anybody else? Mr. Brown, and then I'll go to Mr. Stone and then Mr. May.
So if I understand you right, then the issue comes in when you want to start a project. Like, for example, Osborne Hill, sooner or later, we want to replace these windows. Is that when PCBs become an issue? So if we never touch the windows, PCBs, it sounds like it's not an issue at all.
Not necessarily. I mean,
Well, one of the drivers for it to becoming an issue, so to say, is proper disposal. So there's a statute and a regulation out there that says if you want to dispose of hazardous material, you have to test and dispose of it properly. And that could be, asbestos. And now with this, since 2004, 2009, more and more people are understanding that PCBs are in these materials. So now they're testing it for it. So in our practice, when we deal with either tanks or soils or releases of chemicals, it's, what was there, what caused the release, what chemicals got released, and then we test for those things to see what's there. And we make judgment calls on what to test for. There's many things to test for. And now, as this industry and the practice is maturing a little bit, people come to realize that in these sealants from the 60s and 70s, it's common to have PCBs in it, and where in the past we might have just tested for asbestos, now we got to test for PCBs as well. So that's coming, and once you test for it, then if it's over a threshold, then you're required to do an action.
Right. But to answer your question too, so we're going to take into account the condition of the material. Like, so if we see a suspect material, it is pretty analogous to asbestos in this particular sense, which is you could have insulation that's in fantastic condition. It's not being blown upon by your HVAC system. There's no, it's isolated in maybe a wall column, a pipe, a hot water pipe or something. Everything's fine. There's no exposure potential. It's in good condition. You're probably not going to start worrying about sampling it unless you say, oh, I'm going to be taking this wall down. So in that kind of case, obviously you need to be proactive. You don't want to have an incident where you start demolishing a material or removing a window and then say, oh, it had PCBs in it, and now I've just contaminated, a much wider area and caused a much bigger problem. So it's not only, is it a suspect material, but it's the exposure potential and it's the condition of the material. So some caulking is still in great shape, or it might be on the outside of the building versus the inside of the window, things like that. So, we're kind of, I think we're going to weigh some of those factors and basically, like I said, kind of factor those in to maybe prioritize things like, 90% of the stuff looked in good condition, low exposure potential, or showed up negative on the chlorine, scan, which is just a direct read thing. That's not like you have to take a sample and send it to a lab. We can eliminate certain suspect materials as PCB containing. If it shows up no chlorine in it, we know it's probably not a PCB containing material. But then we might have, say, there's 5 or 10% in, 2 schools that were a little bit concerned, I might need to take it to the next step of maybe doing some select sampling or recommending maybe some mitigation, like Jeff said, maybe encapsulation or enclosure of some of these materials. So I think we can't give you, obviously, an answer yet because we haven't done the survey, but those are the kind of factors that we'll be considering. So.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Stone?
I understand where you're coming from, but I have a question. You're saying that 2 in 100,000 could be affected, right?
2 excess cancers per 100,000 people exposed to that.
From PCBs.
To the 2,900, the highest concentration that was found at Osborne Hill. That's all that number's referring to. That 2,900 nanograms per meter cubed was the highest concentration identified before subsequent cleanup occurred at the Osborne Hill School. So basically, Connecticut DPH ran some risk numbers, which I checked myself personally, and they did the math right. And if you exposed a kid all day, every day for 6 years to that concentration, which would not happen because it was in the gym, but just being really conservative, it comes up with a probability of up to 2 potential excess cancers per 100,000 people exposed to that 2,900 nanograms per meter cubed. So that's all that's it.
So basically, the risk is very low,
Yes.
all right? I mean, if you take Osborne Hill, I don't know how many kids, 700 kids in it, you multiply that by 30 years, you don't even get to the 100,000.
Yeah, I actually was doing calcs on that too,
Now-
like how many generations of
Yeah.
kids would it take? And yeah, you're looking way out there.
Right,
So-
but, and then we're spending, $700,000 to $1 million to clean it up. But wouldn't we be better off by just taking tuna fish off the diet?
Well, there's things you can control and things you can't control, and I think, a lot of what I deal with in my world is risk perception and voluntary risk versus involuntary risk. What people choose to eat based on the information they have, that's something that they can either choose to do or avoid or not, whereas if you're saying, sending my kid to a public school and I have an expectation that that school's going to be a safe environment, for my child, that's kind of an involuntary risk, and I think people have a very negative perception when you start saying, well, we're going to keep an exposure at a school maybe a little bit higher than EPA wants, so make sure your kid doesn't, eat any fish in their diet. You start getting into that territory, and I think that's sort of a difficult.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
What I'm just saying is, as you said before, it's everywhere.
It is.
So it's, if we know about it, obviously, we now have to clean it up. But what I'm concerned about is, people have it in their homes, are we just being premature on all this? Because these tests keep changing, the criteria keeps changing, and now we're going to spend money checking all the schools, or maybe not. And I don't know if it's right or wrong, all right? But I'm just saying there comes a cost to all this, and it comes a cost to the town, and we don't know how bad this is. I mean, I've had cancer myself, I know that. So we want the schools safe, absolutely. But there comes a point where you have to also look at some dollars and cents.
Right, and I think that's why I think the approach that Jeff and I described makes sense, because we're not sampling anything. We're not going out and taking any indoor air samples. We're not going to be sending any suspect materials to the lab. We're doing a qualitative inventory, looking at age, looking at condition, looking at exposure potential, extrapolating from other sites where we're like, oh, we've seen that same color paint at the same age building, that's probably a suspect material, running these chlorine scans. We're just getting information at this point in time to help you manage the potential risk proactively. Doesn't mean we're going to recommend doing, spending $1 million on any remediation. It's just, you need to get an inventory so you wrap your arms around it, and it's really not that different from what you had to do under AHIRA for the asbestos in schools. You had to go through and inventory them, so you just knew where things were and what could be managed safely in place. And if you needed to do some, remediation or encapsulation, you could take care of it. But if you have that information, even if it's just qualitative, you're in a much better position to manage
I
your
agree.
risk.
Did you have a question, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, I basically had this, Mr. Stone covered about 80% of what I was going to ask. And the 2 in 1,000, if someone is in the gym for 6 hours a day for 6 years, what does that extrapolate down to if someone is in the gym, you know, the average amount that a student spends in the gym if they go to the school every day for 6 years?
Right,
I mean, obviously, it's going to be much less
right.
than
It's-
2 in 100,000.
Right, it's linear.
Right, so it's going to be, you know, 0.1 or something.
Well, I don't know how
But-
frequently they have gym.
But, so my question is, and Mr. Stone threw out a number that has frequently been heard, that we're going to have a $700,000 or $800,000 remediation project at Osborne. Have you guys recommended remediation of the gym at Osborne? Or is that the decision that, or anything? Because that number that Mr. Stone mentioned is floating around. Is
Yeah,
that-
we haven't been asked to look at that yet. We haven't looked at any of the schools yet,
So there's
including
been no
Osborne.
recommendation?
Correct.
Yeah,
from the
Mr. Mayor.
organization for any-
Mr. Mayor, I think the 700 or 800 is money's already spent at that school, correct? And that does not include the remediation of the gym, correct? So there is a number out there for remediation of the gym that I'm not privy to yet. I don't know. Nor are you. Okay. So I just want to clarify.
No, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions from board members? Mrs. Saltman? Or is it a follow-up, Bob? I'm going to.
Just on the Osborne Hill, we were told we have to remediate it, right? Okay.
Mrs. Altman? EPA, correct?
As Jeff said, once you find it, you have to remediate it. So we found it, we own it. But it all started with the window project, right? Because we're disturbing it, we're taking the windows out, we had to test for it. That's what got the ball rolling. And then as you go through the sources of it to find it and all the other tests that are done, it led down the pathway to the gym and other areas. So what we've spent money on so far to review the bidding is to get the school opened, to get the levels down within the classrooms and all of the classrooms and many of the common areas, and to provide alternate facilities for the gym. We've spent the numbers that have been bandied about to date, but we have someone else looking at, an architect and an engineer looking at what is now the cost going forward to, number one, replace the windows and dispose of the PCBs and remediate the gym and any other permanent fixes we have to do in there. So we have to do it by the EPA.
So if we're testing, say, Holland Hill, and we find it, and we're not doing any new construction on it, do we have to clean it up?
So it's a process, that we go through with it. So if we, test it for some reason, and we usually recommend testing material if there's a project. So it's usually one of the things. If you have a project where you're going to disturb something, then you test the material because you want to manage it from a disposal standpoint. That was the first part of things. There's a separate kind of evaluation of should we evaluate if there's any exposure pathway or risk that we've talked to earlier. And that's a little bit different. That's not the test of the material. That's saying, I looked at this material, it's very friable, it's flaking, it's all over the place. It may have PCBs. I'm not going to remove it because I don't have a project, but I want to see if it may have impacted indoor air, and I would take an indoor air test at that point. And then once you have those data points, then the ball starts rolling with requirements to remediate it, because now you have data over cleanup levels. And a lot of times, if you have a project that it may be a window replacement, the material's going to be removed, you test it, it's over the threshold, you submit a plan into EPA, then they kind of dictate a little bit about next steps. They may say, all right, well, test the indoor air because we're concerned, and that's at their privy to then direct it because it's not within the regulation.
You're on a roll?
What other schools in Connecticut have you tested and they've taken out the PCBs? I mean, is there a bunch of them, or?
We've worked on a bunch of school projects. A lot of them are projects, that they've started with either a demolition project or a renovation project.
More renovation.
Yeah, so we've done 3 schools in New Haven with the Board of Education for New Haven and their new school program. And a lot of our other work is with colleges and universities. So we've done, I think our count is now roughly around 150 buildings or so where we've gone in, done some level of assessment, either sampling, remediation, renovation, and in the typical project that we see, and a lot of times on campuses, they have a lot of buildings. We look at them, and there's more non-PCB buildings than there are PCB buildings. That's a norm that we're seeing. And I think even in some of the small data set that's here for some of the schools that were tested, those 5 schools, I think 2 of them, of the materials that were tested, did not find PCBs. So I think that's standard. And a lot of them are just the projects, and they haven't really got into indoor air issues. The material's intact. It hasn't caused that pathway, like the limited sampling that was done at Ludlow High School around that caulking. It didn't result in an indoor air test. And at Osborne Hill, if this window project was going forward, they tested the windows, and the indoor air was below, that would have been the end of the story. It would have stopped right there. But there was something else that caused it that then kind of kept the project moving.
I'm going to go to Mrs. Alban, who's been patient. Thank you.
Some of my questions have already been answered. Thank you.
Okay. I'll go to Mr. Bolito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Dr. Title, and I apologize for being redundant, but I want to make sure that I absolutely understand this. Who exactly told you that you need to remediate Osborne Hill? What governmental agency? Just so I'm crystal clear.
To the EPA.
The federal EPA?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. You're done. My question for you two. Here's the thing that we're kind of struggling with. We have kind of 2 courses of action here. Osborne Hill, we know we have to remediate it because it's required by law, so that's not an issue. The issue is the other schools, all right? So from what I'm hearing, unlike asbestos, which we know causes cancer, PCBs, the causal link is unclear at this point. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, they consider it a probable carcinogen.
Okay. So we have courses of action where we want to keep our kids safe, we want to do the right thing, but it's going to cost a lot of money. So we can proactively take the PCBs out of these buildings which may be affected, and then find out maybe a few years down the line that there actually is no causal link, and we spend a lot of money for nothing. Or we can do nothing and find out that we've ignored a great health risk to our children. That's kind of what we're looking at here. So are you going to be able to provide any guidance in terms of, as the evidence becomes available, which direction we should go with this? Because it's so vague and uncertain, and when you consider the cost versus the risk, we're really struggling with this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can provide some help with those, and that's what this first study that we're going to look at is really going to assess just that, and take these 16 schools that, if you extrapolate the Osborne Hill numbers out, is an enormously large number, and try to boil it down a little bit and say, all right, these go over here, these go over here, this might not be, and just try to, shorten that field a little bit of what we're looking at and what are some of the potential things to try to understand that, kind of integrate that into maybe some long-term plans. If there's renovations planned for some schools, how does that get into it under what may already happen? Like there might be a plan for a couple of years to get windows redone or something like that. So,
Right.
Try to bring all that together to try to come up with a program approach instead of a shotgun approach of just going out and testing and then having this data and not knowing how to finance it.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Walsh?
And your firm's informally retained and is under contract currently?
We're under contract to do the study.
Okay. And what is the total cost of the study?
I think it was around, our PO was for $33,000, I believe. It's roughly plus or minus a few dollars in that range.
And that'll take us from beginning to end and end up with a formal document at the end?
Yeah, it will be a deliverable on our study. No testing or anything like that, but just our information collection and presentation.
Okay, and is the thought process that at the end of that, there's going to be further work to be done by your firm?
I think we would make recommendations for further work, or what should be done, what are the next steps, and, who does that, how it's done, I guess is not up to us, so to say, but we would then make a recommendation on what would the next steps be.
Okay, but you believe there's going to be a recommendation for further work, correct?
But it might not be any kind of remediation. It might be a management plan and best management practices and training your maintenance workers about what to, do's and don'ts and good practices, like we said. So until we do this first step, it's really hard to predict. It could be, you might be really lucky, and that's wood, right? We might find things in low numbers of suspect
PCB, actually.
materials.
No, I'm
Huh?
kidding.
What? I think it's wood. So, it is hard to predict, and there's a spectrum, but, like Jeff said, it seems like some of the schools aren't even from the era where PCBs were used, so, we're hoping to narrow the universe of things you even need to potentially consider further, but there could be a range of potential response actions. So, the highest, and most costly is some kind of active remediation, but there's a wide spectrum of possibilities that are much less costly.
And how long is it going to take to complete this study?
We had we were going to come to these meetings first, ending with the RTM meeting, and then initiate it. So we're hoping in the December, January timeframe, we would get a chance to go look at the schools and then present our study. So January timeframe is when we thought we'd have something out.
Great. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Please, Mr.
Just as a comment, you said you did 3 schools in New Haven. We should get the names of those schools, what they did, how much it cost. We can use them as a learning curve.
Can we do that? And perhaps Dr. Tittle on the Board of Ed already has that information? Do they? Can we share that? Seeing no other board questions from board members, I have a couple myself, if you don't mind. First of all, I found your presentation very helpful, so thank you. I appreciate that. Can I go to page 4 of your handout materials? I just want to make sure I understand something. What I'm trying to do is put it all into context. I'm trying to put the risk into context, the cost into context, and actually I'm a big cost-benefit guy. And I'm not even so much looking at the cost here versus the benefit that you've laid out, but I'm looking at this chart on page 4, and I'm looking at the cost versus the benefits of attacking some of these other items. You see what I'm saying? I'm looking at it saying, if you look at this, to use your words, the risk that you found was linear, right?
Yeah. Well, when you're asking about exposure potential. So
Right.
if it's a gym, you're going to spend maybe 4 times
Right.
lower.
So my first question, I guess, is, when we go in and remediate it, we found that there's an elevated level in the gym. And that elevated level in the gym is much higher than the EPA level here. And still at a much higher level. To use your own words, the risk is linear, right? Do we have to remediate back down to this EPA level?
Well, I don't know the specifics of whatever kind of enforcement action. I haven't worked on Osborne Hill, so I don't know exactly what EPA may or may not be requiring. That's their default sort of, straight-face tests of, like, if you're below 300, EPA is going to feel really good that there's not a problem. But
Yeah,
if
and
you're
we're going to
above-
spend multi-million dollars to
Yeah,
make them
and
feel good,
I
right?
feel that pain.
I'm just
Yeah.
trying to put it into, whereas they're okay, or the FDA is okay if I'm reading this graph right, the FDA is okay if 1,250 people out of 1 million get cancer from eating fish.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little misleading. That's saying, assuming that the fish were contaminated at the highest allowable level, and that all the fish that someone ate over their lifetime had that concentration of PCB. So there's a lot of assumptions built into these,
Right, and
sort of
that's
examples.
analogous to the assumption of saying somebody's going to spend their entire career in that one room
Right.
for 6.5 hours a day. I mean, it's all...
Right.
I'm looking at it and I'm just saying, wow, really?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and then you have radon out here.
Radon is huge.
Right, so I'm hoping we're spending at least as much money making sure that our buildings are radon.
And if I told you that
Right.
if the radon...
I'm just doing the cost benefit here.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
that's why, like in people's homes, you'll see people with radon systems sometimes if they have
I
high
know it has.
concentrations. But, the other thing that maybe we didn't articulate in a very in a completely explicit way is that, you know, we can do site-specific risk numbers too. I can come up with, if we end up finding a potential problem in one of your schools,
Right.
but it's in a room that's not a classroom, that maybe it's a, you know, some kind of, you know, a mechanical room
Right.
or a library, something that's not necessarily a room that children are in the whole time, I can actually work with developing, you know, a room-specific action level based on the actual types of activities and exposures to that, particular to that school. And so that takes a little bit more work with EPA if we end up being in a regulated situation, but we have come up with our own site-specific numbers before that aren't exactly the same as EPA's because they take into account the specifics of the situation. So there is also that flexibility sometimes that we can, you know, utilize.
And it's done and EPA is approved. I mean, so I think the, you know, even, you know, so now they have indoor air levels with PCBs. The state has levels for other contaminants in soil, in groundwater, and anybody can debate whether that's really a risk or not for those levels, but either the federal government or state has set these levels to be protective and says if you exceed, then you clean up. But you always have the opportunity to look at site-specific cases and do a site-specific risk assessment to say, in my situation or in this situation, this is what we're going to clean up to and why we think it's protective. And they entertain that, they review that, and they'll provide comment to it or approve it.
So you can actually appeal to them and say, hey, look, we know this was what the standard is, but quite frankly, in looking at your standard, this is,
Here's why it's not directly relevant to the situation we have. But here's a number that's conservative and risk-based, and, you know, we're proposing to clean up to this alternate number. And we've been successful in the past with EPA for, you know, a variety of things, for surface contamination, or like Jeff said, sometimes we've worked out things that, again, managing materials in place. If a university says, you know, we're going to get rid of this building in 10 years anyway, so we just need to, like, make it last 10 more years. So we don't want to go in and spend $10 million cleaning up a building that we're only going to have for 10 more years anyway, but we don't want it to be unsafe. So we figure out a way, okay, well, maybe we can, you know, do HEPA vacuuming and then do some kind of encapsulation of the material or encase it in a little box so that people aren't constantly touching it and you know, rendering the material more friable. And so we've worked on those kind of risk management solutions as well with EPA. So, you know, alternate standards, management in place, working with the life of the building, your construction schedule, your capital planning. These are all things that we can work with you on. So.
okay, interesting. I mean, you know, to be clear, I'm a cancer survivor for myself, so I'm not trying to say we don't need to do this. I'm looking at the cost benefit and saying, with everything else on here, I mean, if you look at this chart on page 4, we've just spent an hour or so talking about the lowest number on this chart by a long shot.
Yep.
Wow. Any other questions, comments?
Well, again, it's
Thank
cost
you,
benefit.
thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. We appreciate that. And good luck with your study.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Item number 3 is to hear, consider, and act upon a series of transfer of funds related to the prior fiscal year, actually, to correct overdrafts and department budgets per the attached document. I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Mayor, Mrs. Bossi, and would members of the audit committee who I know have reviewed this feel free to chime in as appropriate to help guide us on your thoughts and discussions, so,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
sure.
I'd like to address first the document you have with the 3 rectangular boxes on it. Schedule of proposed fund balance adjustments, 6/30/12. Proposed actually is no longer the operative word. These are the adjustments the town has made.
You're talking of this page here, right?
No, the next document.
This one, okay. Okay, required adjustments, thank you.
These have been discussed at a previous meeting, and so I'm just going to go through them briefly. You know, and if people have questions, obviously, we can address the questions. What's on this page are A and B are adjustments that we talked about at the prior meeting, that are adjustments in accordance with GASB and GAAP type entries. Box A are those that are of a magnitude such that they're required by the auditors without exception. B are required from a accounting perspective, but would pass adjustment due to materiality, i.e. the amount. But we have made those also. At the last meeting, we mentioned that there was one other item that would just come to our attention the Thursday or Friday before the prior meeting. That led to the third box entry there. We've had to debit the internal service fund workers' comp reserve for an additional $900,000. When we make these adjustments and spread them across the, like, for example, the first one, which was the most work for Ms. Bossy and her staff, the $850,000 to the payroll, that gets spread across the entire payroll of each department. So therefore, that leads then to adjustments that are required, like the, I think it's the Schedule C normally, when we do the B.
The transfers are a separate schedule.
Yeah, I know this. But anyway, the transfer schedule. So what you have, the document that you first held up that is not titled, just starts with the number 1.
Yep.
You have the result of having made these entries, the resulting cleanup entries to ensure that the transfers are such that there's no departments that are over budget inappropriately.
Right, before I turn it over to the, or ask for the audit committee's comments, I'll ask a couple of things that I have, and then I'll turn it over to board members. Okay, required adjustments and adjustments B on this page. These are adjustments that our auditors have agreed to and said they're proper adjustments.
Yes, sir.
The salary adjustment, the gap entry there, that ensures we have 12 months of payroll reflected in the fiscal year 2012 financial statements?
It ensures we actually have more than 12 months, because what it ensures is that all the expenses that were incurred during the fiscal year ended June 30, 2012, or prior, have now all been recorded as of June 30.
So we're overstating 1 year for a catch-up adjustment on this.
Correct, because in July of 2011, we recorded certain expenses related to the fiscal year ended prior to June 30, 2011.
So instead of going back and restating prior years, you're taking a one-time adjustment in the current fiscal year
Correct.
to true up to an all-time number, if you will.
Correct.
The tax overpayments, that's the, are we notifying those people? I think that was a question we all had
There is a handout
that I must have missed.
that in the document.
Yeah.
This handout, which we.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, for 1 second, does Ms. Bossy have, or anybody else have an extra copy of the document we're talking about right now? For some reason, I didn't bring that with us.
Yes, we do. Yes, Ms. Boss.
I just need that specific document.
Can you just pass that along? No. All right. Sorry, Mr. Walsh.
The reserve for tax overpayments, what has transpired in the past is the tax department went through the tax overpayments.
Yep.
By the past, I mean prior to the fiscal year end June 30, 2012, and they made adjustments to, if account XYZ, property owner had a tax overpayment, they would adjust the future year's tax. And so the total of tax overpayments was never really identified. So the proper accounting treatment for this is to identify the tax overpayments and record the liability.
But do you go ahead and notify the taxpayer, or is the
And in
practice?
the past, what has happened is when that tax overpayment, it was basically done pretty much through the IT system, when that tax overpayment was identified, the IT system went through, automatically adjusted the future year's tax, and in the notice for the new tax, there was the new tax bill, there was a notice included in the new tax bill that said you have a tax overpayment.
So the only
So
time
the
they
answer
knew
was
is when they
yes.
get their next tax bill?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Bolito?
In the 50-page package of documents, which I think was encompassing all the follow-up items, there is a document that I think speaks directly to what we're talking about. It says that the statute allows for taxpayers to request in writing a refund of excess taxes not later than 3 years from the date such tax was due, but then it says there's nothing in the state statutes that require a municipality to send notification of excess payment. What I'm curious about, though, is that this letter came from somebody named Cinda. I don't know who that is or who that represents.
Sin is the tax collector.
She's the new tax collector.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry for not having his last name on that, I apologize.
All right, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah,
Now,
Mr.
though
yeah.
there is no requirement, but I think that the town's attitude is, administration's attitude is that we want to notify
Okay.
people if there's a tax overpayment.
Understood. Thank you.
Mrs. Albert?
The practice that the town is employing is not inconsistent with that of lenders who hold escrow accounts. They would adjust for the next fiscal year rather than return those funds. But the question that I had when we first talked about this, and I don't think we have the answer to, is do we have a statutory responsibility to pay interest on the funds while we're holding them?
No, we do not.
Okay.
And another point
Yeah.
to the question is, to the notification rule, based upon a little limited amount of research, most small communities notify. The larger communities, maybe the top 20, 25 population communities in Connecticut do not.
Mr. Walsh?
What is your position as chief fiscal officer going to be on this? Should we be notifying people? Should we be putting something on our website which lists, like the state does? They have a website when people have made overpayments to them. List those people so you could look your name up if you want to see whether you've made an overpayment. What is your position as fiscal officer going to be on this issue?
As I mentioned just a while ago to Mr. Bolito's comment question, I believe it is appropriate that we notify the town, citizens and residents of town, if they've overpaid their taxes.
And how are we going to do that? Are we going to send letters out, or are we going to...
That is something we are struggling with because it becomes a human resource issue as to how we do it. And the latest thought is that we might, at the end of the tax year, bring in a temp person for a couple of months to generate the work necessary to get the letters out. But a final decision hasn't been made.
What is your thought process on using our town website to be a form of notification?
I had not thought about that, but I don't know if, it sounds like a great idea from one perspective. I don't know if people want that information on there. I have no idea.
Well, I don't
I'd
think
have to
anybody
ask
would have a
people.
problem to let people know that they've made an overpayment any way that you can find your name, and it'd be great to work with our IT department so that if you Googled your own name, it might direct you to our website to let you know that you're holding their money.
Yeah, like I said, it sounds like a good idea. I just have not
All
thought
right.
about it before this moment.
Mr.
another
Chairman,
point on
could we think about maybe putting this on our agenda so that the fiscal officer has a chance to think about this, maybe for a date certain, so that he can come back and report back what progress has been made in this area? Like maybe our April meeting?
Yep.
Does everybody think that's a reasonable date?
Mr. Brown, can you put a follow-up note on there?
I sure can.
Thank you. Mrs. Albin?
Again, through the chair to Mr. Mayor, at what point in the fiscal year is it identified that there are overpayments by taxpayers? Is it at June 30th, or do they, because if we start the fiscal year on July 1 and there's a tax bill due July 1 and then we have our quarterly tax bills, at what point are taxpayers' accounts in excess of their annual tax obligation? Has someone actually overpaid their bill for fiscal year 2012-13 already? Or don't we actually see their overage toward the end of the fiscal year?
I have no idea if anyone has overpaid their bill. It seems like that would be unlikely. Some of the overages come from where both the mortgage company, the bank pays, plus the individual pays.
Right.
Some come just because, people, write their checks out for the incorrect amount. But as you mentioned, people pay our taxes in Fairfield, we pay quarterly. So the time to look at it, I would think, would be after that quarterly payment is scheduled to be received.
Okay. And then to Mr. Walsh's question as to using the town website, I think that it certainly sounds like a possibility. I would think there would be a way to notify people that their tax commitment is overpaid, given that we are able to identify those who haven't met their commitment and publicize that information.
It'd certainly drive traffic to the website, no?
It certainly would.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Brown?
Do we have any idea how many taxpayers we're talking about?
No, I don't know. I'd be venturing a guess. I don't remember. I knew the number once, but I don't remember.
Because you have to figure that some of these people don't live in town anymore.
Well,
And-
many of them, the addresses are banks, mortgage companies,
Okay.
et cetera.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not all individuals. In
Do-
fact, it's,
And on that
Not
point, do we have any escheatment requirement for anything? There's no escheatment?
There's no requirement.
no requirement.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on the tax overpayments? How about the fire department pension? I'm curious why this amount is up top and was a required adjustment.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, that was definitive. Good.
Thank you.
What was this one again? Just,
This one was when the fire department contract was ratified.
okay, this was the adjustment back on that one. Okay. Got it. And the open contract reserve, again, that goes to the, for that fiscal year, the, what we set aside as a contingency, correct? Though that's not how it's technically
for
being
the-
funded through these transfers. But
Yes.
this is an amount that we had put aside as a contingency in thinking that contracts would be settled, then they were not settled, right? So we still have to carry this forward, is that?
Correct.
Right. Okay. Any member of the audit committee have anything they want
No, it's pretty much the same as we had discussed.
to? Okay. Is there anything on the items below in B that anyone
Miss-
wants to discuss?
Mr. Chairman, in regards
Yes.
to A, I wasn't sure whether you were just asking questions, so I apologize for not
No
asking
problem.
it when it came up. But under the accrued salary gap entry, the $850,000, why are we taking the entire remaining $850,000 this year? Like last year, we took $350,000, is that correct?
That is correct. That's what it says.
What, so, and that was a number recommended by the auditors at that point in time, is that correct?
That was the minimum amount that the auditors would accept, not the
Okay.
recommended amount. The recommended amount is the full amount. And I don't know, What we don't know is what the full at least I don't, maybe Caitlin does, what the full liability was last year, so how much that left on the table, because that number is different every year based upon payroll periods and month-end dates.
So I guess the question is, if, say we didn't have a surplus, would they be saying we still had to pay the $850,000?
If we didn't have a surplus, they would still be saying you should pay the $850,000, and we'd be trying to negotiate it.
Not that you should pay it, but that you should actually record it.
Thank you. We've already
Yeah.
paid it.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
But last year, they were comfortable with the 350, despite the fact that we had $1.2 million.
I don't know what it was last year. This year it's $1.2 million. Last year it might have been $500,000. I have no idea.
Do we know what it was last year? Does anybody in this room know what it was last
It
year?
was closer to $1 million, but I could get you the exact number.
Okay, so it was $1 million, but they were still, the auditors were still comfortable with the 350.
350 got them under their materiality threshold, yeah.
Would a number less than $850,000 get us under the materiality factor?
I don't know. Do you know?
A number less,
Less than the 850.
I think the answer to that would be yes, because that goes all the way down to zero. And it goes down, and it starts at 849,
So we could book something less.
possibly.
Okay. I mean, this gets into a decision of, I guess, how much, whether we want to burn through the entire surplus with some of these items, or whether we actually might want some of the surplus, or a larger
Look down
percentage
at
of the
the
surplus
bottom
going
of,
to the general fund, correct?
If you look down at the bottom of adjustments B, making these entries leaves us with a surplus of $1,686,762.
And then we have a $900,000 number that you want applied against that, correct? Or no?
That's been recorded, that's in the internal service fund, that does not affect
Okay.
the general fund balance.
So it gets to the point of how much we want to book. $850,000 seems to be the most aggressive figure.
It's the right figure, it's the correct figure, it's the appropriate figure.
So did we book the wrong figure last year? Since the number was $1 million last year, we only booked $350,000. Did we book the wrong number last year?
Here last year, I can't respond to that.
I'm asking you as fiscal officer looking at it, looking back, what was the reason for last year's entry?
I wasn't here last year, I can't respond to that.
All right, the first selectman was here last year. Did we book the wrong number last year? And what was the reason for it?
It wasn't a discussion we had at that point last year, so I'm not sure.
The auditors never brought that up?
Not to me.
Okay, can you get an answer from our auditors of what the reason is they allowed $350,000 to be booked at that point in time, when in actuality our new fiscal officer is telling us that if we booked less than the $850,000 remaining, it would be an error right now?
I did
Not
say
an
that.
error.
Okay.
And I believe that Ms. Bossy, in part, answered that question by saying the 350 got it below the materiality point, so the auditors were willing to accept that.
So I guess the question then is, what is the materiality factor?
That would be correct.
Do you guys have anything you want to say?
So what could we do?
Go ahead. Mrs. Leclerc, did you have a comment on this from the
Well,
audit committee standpoint?
typically, you do accrue the full salary for the year. The trouble is that we already have 1 year, so we're taking more than 1 year into it. So I think, but last year, by taking 350, we took a step in the right direction, but not the whole amount. So the amount to accrue this year is is $1.2 million, but last year we did
The 350.
the 350, so this is the difference. Now, next year, it could swing in a different direction, I believe, once we get to 100%. It depends on how the month breaks that you have to do an accrual.
Right. What the auditors are going to care about materiality-wise is that you've accounted for 12 months.
Right.
Right.
It's kind of the same issue you have on the revenue side also, is, so that's...
Well, to me, it just seems like we should have a consistent policy 1 year to the next. either we book the full amount or we don't.
Well, the problem is with the budgeting, sometimes there's more than 52, it could be 52 and a half weeks. I mean, it all depends on the number of days or how the week kind of splits. So potentially, when we always budget, I believe, over 52 weeks. So potentially, there could be a couple days difference, and over time, it made this variance.
But when we're doing budgeting, can we look at the coming year and know how many days we have and properly budget for
I
that?
don't think we budget that way. I believe it is a set amount per someone's salary per year.
This is a good conversation. I would hope that we budget for the actual number of days in the year.
Mhm.
And if we don't, we will this year. But the point is that the accounting, I don't think it's budgeting necessarily, I think it's accounting. The town has accounted for payroll based upon the period the payroll is paid. So if people work from June 25th to June 30th and not paid until July, or from, I don't know if there's some people that are paid bi-weekly, bi-monthly, from, June 16th to June 30th, and they're not paid till July, that has always been recorded in July, and had been recorded in the new fiscal year, rather in the prior fiscal year, where the work and the resource was utilized to match the expense with the time of the expense, which is the proper accounting for anything, matching your revenues and expenses in your timelines.
Right. In essence, this is a 2-year transition. This is the end of a 2-year transition to get to a more consistent accounting policy after this is done. If you were to break this 850 in pieces and only take part of it this year, you'd take the next part of it the next year, and instead of having a 2-year transition plan, you'd have a 3-year transition plan, or
It's an entry
perhaps
that
4
ensures,
years.
hopefully, that we won't have to make it again.
Right. If we don't make the full amount this year, you'll be coming back next year with a figure probably under 850, but depending on what we book this year, right?
And I guess I understand that. I guess it's just, we have to acknowledge that we're doing it because of the larger surplus this year, and that's what I've not heard so far. That's
Right.
the reason you're doing it. You're being aggressive this year to try to catch up all
Like
in
I
one
said
year because
earlier,
you have
Mr. Walsh,
excess surplus.
When you asked, like I mentioned earlier, in response to your question, if we did not, an entry is required even if we had a deficit. That's number one. Number two, if we had a deficit or if we had a smaller surplus, there probably would have been some negotiations going on, and it probably would have resulted in a lower number. But it is the correct accounting, and it brings the town's books into a better accounting position.
Well, that's the word I guess I was asking you about before, correct, because correct last year was 350 when the number was $1 million, and correct this year is 850,000, which is,
No, this is the correct, this makes it fully correct. Last year, it made it partially correct.
okay. And I guess that's where I guess if we're going to talk definitional terms, then the question is why are we going fully correct now? First, the auditor thought it was proper to go partially correct last year.
It's what I think we should do, it's what the auditors think we should do.
He thinks we should go fully correct
Yes, sir,
finally.
yes.
Okay. But you understand how, when you're sitting in this seat and you're trying to think that you should have a consistent plan, that I have no reason why last year he's saying, let's go partially correct, to use your terms. Are we going partially correct in other areas? I mean, this is, when you say that and we start skinning this onion like this, there's partially correct and there's fully correct. It just adds to the confusion of what we're doing. It's just, I think what you're saying is that we have a large surplus this year, so you're trying to play catch-up. But you don't seem to want to say that. You just want to start using fully correct and partially correct. So,
Like I said, even if we had a deficit this year, an
Yeah.
entry would be required, even if there were a deficit.
okay, but there was last year we went partially correct, even though, did we have a surplus last year?
I have no clue.
Yeah. You have no clue? Okay.
we
well,
did.
we did, yeah. We had a surplus and we went partially correct.
Yeah, I have no idea what the materiality factor, I know, for example, because of a discussion that took place, the materiality factor this year in the General Service Fund is about $130,000. I have no idea what the materiality factor in the general fund is.
Can we find out what the materiality factor is
Do you
from the
guys-
auditor?
Do you guys know, by any chance, off the top of your heads? No?
I think it'd be good for other discussions, so if we can find out what the materiality factor is
Well,
from our auditor.
There's a very easy way to figure some of this out. Do they prepare a waived adjustment schedule?
I'm sure
Last
that,
year, yes, for their past entries, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can we?
Every year they do that,
Yeah, can we get a copy of this year's waived adjustments
for the 12 audit.
for this audit?
Yep.
Yeah. What that schedule that I just asked for is it's things that they noted through their testing that they made a note of, but they did not require a change because it didn't materially change the financial statements. It's a very common practice that they'll go through and said, we noted this, but it's not material enough to mislead the reader of the financial statements, so we are not requiring the adjustment to be made.
correct.
So
Common
if
audit document.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, common audit document.
Right. So if we can get a copy of that, that'll tell us exactly other items that they, the surprising part is I had never heard of, quite frankly. I don't know if you guys had on the audit committee. I had never heard of this item in previous years. Did this ever come up before, to your knowledge?
I think so.
Yeah, okay. That
I
there-
don't know
but
whether
was
it
just a
came up in the
matching
audit
principle.
committee, right.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
Okay.
And I don't know if it's, we weren't concerned because we were still picking up 12 months of expense.
Exactly. Right,
Um,
right.
so.
Exactly. Okay. Any other questions on these items that are on this schedule? We can, it's at the board's pleasure, we can go through the required adjustments, with the exception of the fire department pension, or the adjustments B. I do want to hear a little bit more about the internal service fund adjustment, because that's something that is, it was mentioned last time, but I think you're ready to speak to it now. But before we go there, are there any questions on, does the audit committee have anything they want to say on the other adjustments here? Adjustments B. Feel free.
Well, I still think we need approval for this Housing Committee one. I still don't agree with it. I mean, it's never come to a town board. It started out as just an internal transaction that we helped the Housing Authority do payroll, and it became a loan, and now it's being reserved against. So they're technically adjusting our financials by $65,000. And so I think it either has to come to the town boards for approval, or they shouldn't reserve against it, and they should try to collect the money.
Thank you, Mrs. Leclerc. If I can follow up on that. Mr. Tetro, this came out in the early part of your administration, right? Did this come out in the summer of your first year? I'm trying to remember when this came out. Yeah. I think you were on the Board of Selectmen, right?
This came out in January of 2011, when I was on the Board of Finance. And
It
it was
was
raised as
mentioned,
a
right?
discussion item right here.
Yeah.
And at the time, the number being discussed, I think, was in the ballpark of $65,000.
Right.
The auditors had not, weren't aware of it. They weren't aware we're doing payroll for outside companies. It was identified, or outside organizations, I don't mean companies. At that time, we were told the practice had stopped,
Right.
and that our exposure was $65,000, and it was going to get paid back.
Yeah, and...
It was then, in that summer, as Mr. Walsh referenced, in I believe actually July, when we had difficulty reaching them, and the amount had grown to $165,000.
Right.
We finally sat down. They were able to pay us $100,000 because of the way their books are organized and the different, I think the 3 different categories they have. They were able to pay us $100,000 out of the funds they had that were in the black. They had difficulty with the third one, and that's where the $65,000 is due from. So they can't pay us from their other funds due to government regulations and how their funding works. They we'll have to wait for this particular fund for them to generate a surplus in order to pay us. So to Mrs. Leclerc's point, we're not stopping collecting this. We are not taking the spotlight off of this. We're just recognizing that it's going to be a very long time before we see that $65,000.
Okay, and to that point, and yes, I remembered it came up here during a budget conversation or something like that, and then it wasn't.
During the review of our financial statements in January 2011.
And then it was fully vetted in the summer of that year, as you point out. Is there any documents, I can't recall, about them agreeing to pay us back in total? I think there was.
I believe we have a memo from
Yeah, I think
the
it's
Housing
in-
Authority acknowledging the debt and acknowledging that they don't have the funds to pay it at this time.
Quick question, has that ever gone before, or do we know, should it go before, to Mrs. Leclerc's point, any other town body before we start messing around with the accounting for it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure who prior to January 2011 knew that this practice was taking place.
I understand that.
So I'm going to suggest that
Yeah.
the practice didn't, beyond that, other than acknowledging it before the Board of Selectmen, and I don't believe we voted on it from that standpoint. It was reported to us.
Right.
And then, and Mr. Walsh, I'm going to ask your help on this. I don't know if the board authorized me to or not to sit down and work out an agreement, and we came back and passed, but I don't remember a formal vote per se on any other board, certainly, and that authorization would be, whether it was a conversation or an actual vote, I'm just not, I just don't remember.
My recollection is it happened over 2 Board of Selectmen meetings because somebody didn't show up the first time, and then they
Correct.
asked to come back and properly with a new accountant because they had also lost their accountant. And then they finally came back and it worked out, I think, with your office that they could, the most they can come up with right now is $100,000, and that they would try to find a way to pay the remaining balance and get back to your office at a certain point.
Yeah,
And-
there were some auditing issues that
Yeah,
they
there
had
was-
to
they
get
were doing
through at
auditing.
that point.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, you'd asked to
I
address.
want to make sure that we're understanding what we're doing here.
I understand what we're doing.
Basically, what the town has is an impaired asset,
Mm-hmm.
the collection of which, in the near term or midterm, is very, very unlikely. The correct accounting treatment for an impaired asset is to reserve for it. Reserving for it does not mean writing it off. Therefore, it is not a authorization to spend money. It's basically an accounting function, accounting requirement. You have an impaired asset, you write it down, you reserve for it. Doesn't mean you don't try to collect for it. We're not writing it off. It keeps its position on the books and records of the town. We stay aware of it, and we continue to try to collect it as appropriate and as reasonable.
Thanks for the accounting lesson, I got it.
You're very welcome. Seemed necessary.
You're wrong. But the issue with it that I have is whether the practice should have happened in the first place. I mean, to Mrs. Leclerc's point, does the RTM know about this? Are all town bodies fully informed that this group owes money to the town because of something that happened that was never authorized, right? That's your point.
Right.
So I'm not debating whether it's an asset that should be, that is impaired. I'm not debating the accounting treatment of it. I'm debating, does everybody know that needs to know about this?
To the best of my knowledge, it's been discussed a couple of, actually 2 or 3 meetings here at the Board of Finance.
Absolutely.
It's been discussed at least 2 Board of Selectmen meetings.
Right.
And I know there were RTM members sitting in on some, if not all of those meetings. But
Right.
I don't believe there's been a formal discussion that I remember right off the top of my head.
And we don't know
At an
whether there was
RTM.
a vote to, I mean, from you, I'm going by you two gentlemen. You don't remember whether there was a vote authorizing some action. That's what I'm trying to get to.
I never remember there being a RTM agenda item on this matter.
Oh, not an RTM.
Well, no, I mean, a Board of Selectmen.
Oh, Board
item.
of Selectmen.
Was there a vote on it? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I thought it was more of a report.
At some point, it was definitely a discussion, and I think, as I remember it, and forgive me if I'm not quite right, I was asked by the board to meet with the Fairfield Housing Authority and work something out, which is what we did, and we reported back to the Board of Selectmen. Now, I don't know if that was officially voted. Forgive me, I just don't know if there's
I
an
don't
official vote
remember there
taken.
being a vote. I thought it was more of a report. Mr. Hiller did most of the speaking about it, and the background about it, and what was going on.
In terms of the accounting entry, it's immaterial, I'm fine. It's a reserve, to Mr. Mayor's point, of an impaired asset. That doesn't necessarily bother me so much. I wonder if we're covered, is the town attorney, what's he say? Do we need anything to be done here to secure our rights to this asset? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Chair, I certainly do, and the reason for the accounting lesson is I think there were some people who were thinking we were writing it off, and I wanted to make that very clear, that it's not a write-off. And to Ms. Leclerc's point, which you just clarified, it is a asset on the books that was created without authorization.
Exactly.
By any body of the town.
Right.
And
I don't know what the implications
and
of
I
that.
don't know, I mean, basically the town
Right.
loaned money out without authorization, in
Right.
essence. And I'm not sure, I agree with you that I think people should be aware of it, the RTM should be aware of it, that
Right.
certainly makes sense. But I'm not sure at this point what else.
Yeah, I just,
Well, maybe
Maybe
I
maybe
think there
legal
could be
counsel
several. I
knows.
think there can be several things done, and Mr. I'm not sure whether you've had a chance. I think this came up the last time we discussed it here, was to talk. There's been articles, there's been stuff on the internet that the FBI's been involved because these are federal funds, where they stand, whether there's any type of lawsuits, because there's a woman who left the employee of the town and went out to some
Excuse me,
place-
this is not a town agency.
No, but
This is not an organization that is chartered under the town. This is not a town agency.
I didn't say that they were. I'm
Said an
sorry, I'm
employee
sorry.
of the town.
Not an employee, employee of the Housing Authority, who left this area and went to some place called Truth and Consequences, North New Mexico, or something like that, and that because it was a housing authority and they were using federal funds, the FBI was pursuing her and things like that. And whether they've turned up funds that might come up, I don't know where that stands, and I don't know whether you've had any conversations with the Housing Authority about pursuing any lost funds. I think it would be nice to get an agreement with the Housing Authority that's binding between the town and the Housing Authority, where, one, they acknowledge the debt to the penny, where maybe they get into some type of payment plan. I don't care whether it's $100 a month, where they will have some funds coming into the town, whether it takes 25 years to recover or not. I think it would be nice to know that if they got a settlement or recovered any of the funds that were really, if there were any, from allegations that were absconded, that we would be first in line to get those funds. But something that's written down where we can settle this kind of now, where, whether we get into a long-term payback, if they get funds back, that they don't go into something else and they use them for some other purpose. So I think that would be something we should explore.
I think we're all coming at it the same way.
I'm
Mr.
just
Tetra.
more than happy to take a look at that. And I want to be clear with everybody here that the Housing Authority has been very cooperative throughout this process. They had some internal issues to clear up. Some involved some of the cases that Mr. Walsh mentioned, but they've been very open, very flexible with us in terms of stepping through this. While it's not, I don't know if I term it a binding letter, they certainly acknowledged in writing the debt from that standpoint. And this is something that has accumulated, Ms. Bosley, if I'm correct, over about a 10-year period. This wasn't just a...
It's from 99, yeah.
All right. So this is something that this was a practice established by the town over time, and this is, as I understand it, one of those cases of what I'm going to call accumulated differences over that time period. It wasn't, we missed one payroll period and didn't get it, so
Right.
it's something that accumulated over time on that basis.
Thank you.
But I
Mr.
just want to be clear that the Housing Authority has been very cooperative in working with us. And going back to the point, and again, when Mr. Walsh and I got more involved in this last summer, or summer of 2011, There were some issues on how cooperative they were. I want to just be clear to everybody that since that point in time, they've been exceedingly open and cooperative with us.
Right. Mr. Mayor, did you have a follow-up? Thank you, Mr. Tetra.
It's two comments, actually. One, the authorities are pursuing the person who has allegedly absconded some money. That is an ongoing investigation and action with no culmination as of my last conversation, which was about a week ago. Number two, the Housing Authority, in the fund that owes the town this money, has a $347,000 federal deficit. One thing I do not know is if they could pay this money before clearing up that deficit. That becomes a federal issue that would...
Right, right. Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. Can
And
we
just also to explain, and this again came out during our Board of Selectmen discussion in the summer 2011, we've been working with the Housing Authority because they perform a very valuable service to our community, and we didn't want to see that go away. All right, so we had the opportunity, in fact, we sat down with the federal agency, and they were looking at closing up shop. So we sat down with them and identified that we were supportive of that we would work with the Housing Authority and have done that. And the Housing Authority has brought in new management, new director, who is phenomenal in terms of what she's able to do.
routine payments on this now, Mr. Tetra?
Not at the moment.
No. Okay. Yeah, Mr. Brown, and then I'll go to...
It might be in the packet, but there is reference to a letter from, is Carol Martin the current executive?
She's the current executive director, yes.
Okay, so on October 29th, she sent a letter to Mr. Mayor
Yep.
acknowledging she owes us the money,
I thought I saw that, right.
but she's also asking if she could be released of that obligation. Correct. Now, I don't know, have you had the opportunity to discuss that with her since this letter?
No, that letter was distributed to the board a couple of meetings ago, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
I remember that
Last
letter. I didn't
meeting.
remember whether it was
Yeah.
formal. Yeah.
Yeah, the position is,
So she just has to know what position is, that we don't intend to let that $64,000. We do not intend to write off the $64,000, correct?
Yep.
Correct.
right, and as I indicated earlier, we're not writing it off.
I know. But it
I think
seems,
we're
My question is-
I have passed that information on to both the chairman of the board and the director of the Housing Authority.
you have passed that on?
Yes.
Okay.
Any,
And I'd just like to say, I don't think, and I don't mean to speak for my colleagues, that there's anybody who doesn't see the value in the Housing Authority. I don't think any of us are seeing to try to break them or do anything such as that. But the town has been good to the Housing Authority, and the Housing Authority's been good to the town. But I think an agreement that acknowledges the debt, paying a small amount towards it on a consistent basis that will not break their budget, to whatever, your office feels is appropriate, would go a long way to the good faith of the town. I also think that if they do get some type of settlement in the future, specifically from an incident that kind of put them in the red, that was really town funds, that we should have some right to that, or some percentage of that, to kind of reduce the debt, and just go forward as, a cooperative, relationship would be. So, I'll leave that to your office to negotiate.
Okay, thank you, and we'll take that guidance.
Thank you.
all right. Any other questions, comments, concerns from board members on this? Mrs. Leclerc, how are you? Good. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Tetra. Mr. Mayor, can you step us through the internal service fund adjustment here? Just you were kind enough to walk me through it, I think.
Yeah. Mr.
But could you
Chair,
walk everybody?
Yeah, basically in 1982 or 83, an event occurred that led to a person who became severely disabled. The town had a deductible and a $2 million excess insurance policy at that time for workers' comp claims. The claim at that time, had it been, I'm sure it was by someone, fully evaluated, it would have been clear that it exceeded $2 million excess, but no one has ever properly recorded the town portion of the liability on its books and records. This event came to my attention the Thursday or Friday before the last meeting, and based upon the evaluation and discussion with the workers' comp administrator and with the auditors, we concluded at this time that the town's liability, that $900,000 is a sufficient amount to accrue. This will be evaluated on an annual basis.
Okay, so questions, comments from board members on this item? Go ahead, Ms. Leclerc.
So is that what you're estimating us to owe over the life of the claim? Or is that just for the fiscal year ended June 30th?
The life of the insurance company is still obligated for about $478,000. So that plus the 900 would be $1,000,003, $1,000,004. But like I mentioned, that's the best estimate at this point. It will require annual review.
Mr. Walsh.
Do we use Aon to do our workers' comp reserve amounts?
No, we use a company called PMA.
It's Mr.
Why didn't they pick up this amount earlier?
I'm sorry, sir?
Why didn't they pick up on this amount earlier? I mean, it seems to me as on a year-to-year basis, they should have started seeing that we were going to have a problem with this reserve amount, if they're making the recommendation on what our reserve for
They
workers'
actually-
comp should be.
To be honest with you, I cannot remember how it came to my attention. At the point, it came to my attention. I checked to see if it was in the reserve, identified that it wasn't, and then took the proper steps to develop the number for our reserve.
Could I ask through the chair that we have you, Mr. Mayor, contact them and ask them how they did not possibly pick this $900,000 reserve amount up when they're making their recommendations to us, and we're paying them a fee to do that, and they missed $900,000 telling the town we should have reserved for this a long time ago?
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Mayor, if you wouldn't mind, and you had done this for me privately, and I thought pretty well, walk us through the events, what happened. This happened a number of years ago.
1982.
We paid off for a number of years.
$100,000 our deductible.
Then as soon as our deductible was...
The mic, please.
Oh,
With this
Sure.
background noise over here,
Yeah.
it's very hard to hear.
oh, what is there,
We've got
a vent or something?
air vents running.
Yeah. Okay. I
Sorry.
figured there was enough hot air in here that we didn't need the air vents. So we had $200,000 we paid off the deductible.
Correct, sir.
Then after the deductible, insurance kicked in
Correct.
and lasted for some 25 years or so.
The insurance still has like I said, $480,000 plus or minus remaining to be paid. So there'll be no cash outflow on this.
Right.
For a year or two or three, maybe.
But then was this an actuarial study that was done that said, based on this person's life, based on the
Yes, sir.
expense, you're going to exceed the insurance deductible, and therefore, at this point in time, you need to start putting up a reserve against this amount?
Correct.
So then annually, just like in our other insurance areas, there'll be an actuarial study done to determine whether this reserve for this one claimant continues to be accurate or needs to change.
Correct. The severity of this case and the situation of this case is that I'll be looking at it as not as an isolated case, but
Right.
as a standalone item.
Right. Okay. So,
Mr. Mayor, you individually stumbled upon this?
Like I said, I don't remember how I came up, I came across it in some correspondence somewhere. I asked the question, is this in our reserve? I got the answer, it was not.
And have you talked to our consultant about this issue?
Yes.
And what have they said?
Well, they were instrumental in helping with the determination of the reserve requirement. They've been monitoring the case.
Has the person's past employee's life expectancy changed at all?
I think at this stage, that's, I can't answer that question.
All right, but you'll get an answer on how they, I mean, to me, it seems as though you picked it up, they didn't, and we're relying on them to give us reserve amounts as part of our consulting fee?
Or they anticipated that we had accrued for, I have no idea. I have no idea where the ball was dropped.
I'd just like to know the process, because I'm trying to figure out how we don't do this again. You know, what confidence level do we have on the current claims we're paying that we're meeting all of our reserve amounts for each individual employee? And has the as the consultant we've hired that we're paying money for looked at each claim and looked at each life expectancy, and are we planning properly for those?
The answer to that, I think, is yes. You know, the process is in place. It's, you know, PMA seems to be a qualified and well-respected workers' comp third-party administrator. They are managing our claims. I don't know when we first started working with them. They are managing this claim as well. But for some reason, it just never made it into, they reserve, you know, their reserve analysis that they do covers 100% of the remaining claimants. Why this was a standalone and not included on our books, I can't answer that. I think that it would have been apparent long ago that the town was going to owe money on this after the insurance policy runs out.
Maybe you, Mr. Chairman, and anybody from the board, I guess I'm asking, does it make sense to, I mean, we keep increasing our amounts to the internal service fund to try to, you know, we've spent a lot of effort over, and when I was on the Board of Selectmen with Mr. Tetra, we spent a lot of time and effort and money trying to increase the internal service fund to properly account for it, and seeing another $900,000 deduction when we think we keep correcting it is kind of a disappointing number to see. Whether, when they appear, will they be appearing before us, this consultant?
They will be. They'll be before us typically during the budget process to discuss the internal service fund and some of these items.
Well, maybe it makes sense at that point in time that they be fully prepared to discuss with us this issue, since they'll be before us. So not to waste anybody's time in another meeting on it, but we talk about this.
Mr. Mayor, that's Mr. Perno, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good memory.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns on this schedule or on these items? All right, then I think the item for action, the action item, is actually the prior 2 pages, correct? Which are the actual transfers.
Yes, sir.
So now, do I have to read these transfers out loud, or can we stipulate these transfers in the minutes? Excuse me?
You could, if you can identify the document, as per the document, we'll include all of them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ms. Salmon. We're going to refer to the document as the schedule of transfers, and it would be these 2 pages. And we'll call it the schedule of fiscal year 2012 transfers. That's now before us. Thank you. Any questions, comments, concerns on individual items? Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, I just want to bring the board's attention to the last paragraph on the second.
I was going to ask that myself. I need a definition of minor before I would have agreed to this.
Trust me.
What's a definition of minor?
Whatever you call it.
Okay,
We did review these with the auditor,
right,
and since everything in the CAFR is rounded,
yep.
they were the same rounded figures as these, so on the off chance, because I need to do the exact dollar in the ledger, that there's some minor, $1 or $2, I'm talking rounding.
Okay, so it's rounding errors. Okay. So the first thing on the document, I would like to make a motion that we refer to the last sentence, that we add the words "to address any minor rounding adjustments necessary."
Yeah, do we want to put some kind of cap, like under 10,000?
Under
$100?
Under $100. How's that? Will that give you flexibility for the CAFR?
I believe so.
You want to go under 1,000? Will that give you?
That'd be
That's, because it's, okay, so let's go under 1,000. I'm not trying to hem you in here.
Yeah, no, because we want to go to print.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, to any minor adjustments under $1,000. Do I have a second to that motion? Mr. Bolito, any questions, comments, concerns on that motion? Okay. All in favor of adjusting the last paragraph of the document? Oh, we can go to the public on that, thank you. Anybody? Okay. All in favor of adjusting the document in the last paragraph to read, in addition, the chief fiscal officer is hereby given authority to adjust the transfer amounts as necessary to address any minor rounding adjustments up to $1,000 necessary that might be required as a result of the audit and/or report presentation. Everybody set with that? Mm-hmm. Okay. All in favor? Those opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Any other comments on the schedule of adjustments? Anybody?
Just a quick question. There seems to be a lot coming out of streetlights. Is that because of the new electric contract that we negotiated? It seems a number of different things comes from streetlights, 2 different departments.
Yeah, there was a surplus there, so I...
Because of the
yeah,
electric
yeah.
contract that we renegotiated?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Do you know what the general total of excess that was?
Okay.
I believe it was 61,000.
61,000? Okay.
And what was the total budget there? Do you remember?
718?
Okay.
And the actual
Nice
came in at
number.
657.
Nice number. Good. Anybody? Mr. Walsh?
What were the excesses in the first selectman's office and the human resources caused by?
All of the, you're looking at the schedule of transfer sheets?
Yes.
All of these are a result of the accrued salary entry, except for the 761 and the 35,000.
Okay.
All the other departmental transfers on here were due to that 850 adjustment.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Any member of the audit committee have anything they want to talk about? Anything that you looked at? Okay. I'll go to the public, seeing nothing on this, and back to the board. Can I have a motion to approve this? Mr. Bolito, can I have a second? Mr. Brown? Okay, the motion is now before us to approve the schedule of transfers of funds for fiscal year 2012 as amended. For that last sentence, all in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? It carries. Thank you. Thank you for your work on that. All right. Briefly, because we will see a presentation on this, I believe, during the budget process on the next item, but I did want to, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Tetro were kind enough to get this information from our actuary, so I wanted to make sure this came before us.
Mr. Chair, you have a B on your current agenda.
I'm sorry?
You have another item on your current agenda item.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I forgot. Thank you. Thank you. I crossed it out. Go ahead. We'll go to item number B, 60-day rule impact. Go ahead.
All right, basically, the town's, does everybody have the document?
It is labeled 60-day rule impact.
I'm going to read a little bit from that for the benefit of the public. The town's current year levy revenue line item currently represents collections each year for the months September 1 through August 31. This is known as the 60-day revenue rule. This rule is allowed by state statute, excuse me, sorry, I'm just getting over a cold, I hope, and is in compliance with GASB. However, it does not allow the town to properly match the town's revenues and expenses which are recorded on a fiscal year basis. So we'd like to improve our accounting records. So this is not an audit-required adjustment. It's an auditor-preferred, and it's a fiscal officer preferred. We'd like to improve our accounting records to better match our revenues with our expenditures. We are suggesting at this time we do this in 2 steps. The first step which would like to make effective June 30, 2012, i.e. recorded in the close for fiscal year end 2012, would be to transition from the current 30-day difference, 60-day difference to a 30-day difference. And then you see in the schedule the impact this would have on the June 30, 2012 financials and on a very key item, target item, which is the net fund balance divided by general fund expenditures. Our unadjusted fiscal year 2012 general fund expenditures, $278 million. The fund balance unadjusted, $16,687. Committed funds, that's primarily encumbrances, $2,094,000, giving us a net fund balance of $14,593,000, which gives us a ratio of fund balance to general fund expenditures of 5.255%. If we were to make this adjustment, that would reduce the net fund balance by $415,000, which represents the revenue collections made in August, excuse me, in August, thank you. And our adjusted fund balance would be $14,178,000, which would provide us with a net adjusted fund balance divided by general fund expenditures of 5.106%. The fund balance there divided by expenditures for June 30, 11 was 5.12%. So if we don't make this entry, we improve our ratio of fund balance to expenditures. If we make this entry, it's a minor diminishment. And that would reduce, going back to the earlier page, where current, with the entries we discussed earlier, our surplus for the year ending fiscal year ended June 30, 2012, $1,686,000. If you subtract the 1, 4, and 5, you get $1,271,000 would be our year-end net surplus.
What was our year-end surplus last year, just for,
$1,600,000 something, hold on.
Well,
Okay.
she's looking at that. If taking the current year budget, if you assume that the current year ends with a balanced budget, no surplus, no deficit, our ratio would stay above 5% at 5.07%.
$1,638,000.
okay, so in any instance, by doing this, we don't go below 5%?
Correct.
Close, but
Huh?
we're close.
Right, right. Any questions, comments, concerns on this item? Mr. Brown?
Just comment, I mean, 5% was a milestone.
Yep.
But it wasn't the end goal. And we know what the rating agencies, what they say about this, between this surplus and the Internal Service Fund, I mean, they focus on it. They compliment the fact that the town was able to get above 5%, but they're looking for us to get to 6% and above, which was stated in their last report in June. So it's a minor diminishment, but it still is a diminishment. And I just think we need to think about that and be careful. Maybe we take it up in the budget season. But I'm very, I'm concerned about slipping below 5%. And if we're too close, I'm a little uncomfortable with that. I'm uncomfortable with going backwards in any step, right? Even if it's as small as this, because it is heading in the wrong direction. It's taking a step back, even though it's a small step back. And, we need to consider the point that we need to take this surplus to the higher end of 5% and 6%, and I don't even think that's the final number that Moody's is looking for. But they definitely are looking for improvement. make that statement. Thank you.
I couldn't agree with Mr. Brown more. I think it was the first selectman who told us that we weren't really trying to get to 5%, we were actually trying to get closer to 10%, and we were going to work up to that number more. Previous administration and tried to tell us that 5% was the goal. We were kind of blindsided to find out that that's kind of the minimum level for a AAA community, something we all preciously try to retain. We came in here with a preliminary surplus of $4 million. We've done a bunch of, there's some proposed entries here that we're going to be deducting from that. And to hear that we actually might be going down in that number is shocking. And I have a hard time doing it. I mean, it's just, I agree with Mr. Brown that this number should be going in the opposite direction. We just had a great surplus, and now all of a sudden we're going to be going the other way. We can't fix all the problems in 1 year. And that's my concern, and that's why I was raising the earlier questions about that $850,000, whether we had to be aggressive, whether that's considered fully correct or partially correct, or whatever that conversation is. I don't think we can fix all the ills in 1 year. I think it's great that we had a surplus, but with a surplus like this to be going in the opposite direction, I don't think we can, I can't support that.
Anyone else? Mr. Mayor, Mr. Brown brought up something that I hadn't even thought of. How would we go about addressing an issue like this in the budget process? So that's actually a very compelling idea, if we could do it prospectively and again get to the same result, because I, like you, Bob, would like to clean up the accounting for it and have it more on an apples-to-apples basis. So I get where we're trying to go here, but I think that the comments regarding the going in the wrong direction in the surplus, I understand that too. So how would we address that in the budget process? Change in accounting principle, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I would like to thank the chair for his comments about cleaning up the accounting, and I fully understand Mr. Brown and Mr. Walsh's concerns. You know, the way to address this kind of issue in the budget process, thinking off the top of my head here, would be to budget the surplus for the following year, an amount that would adjust this with the idea of, as everything else works out, we all know how budgets are. This year, this past fiscal year, we had very favorable results.
Largely
with
because
the
of the debt. I mean, largely because of the debt renegotiation.
That was
yeah.
1 million, yes.
Yeah, right.
But to, you know, budget an amount in next year's budget, and if things work out, then use it that way. If they don't work out, say, well, next time.
Right, right. Good.
Right, and I understand also the Mr. Mayor wants to clean up the accounting. It's just that, you know, if we were at 7.5%,
Right,
maybe you could say, okay.
right.
But we're right at that edge, and we don't know what's gonna, we don't know what's gonna happen when we get to the budget. We do know it's gonna be a tough budget. We know, just when we talk about the pension, we know it's gonna be a tough budget. So, again, maybe with, like Mr. Walsh said, it's, I think we're too close. We're too close. And with Mr. Walsh, I just can't do it at this point. Maybe in a year, we can take a look at this again.
And to follow up on, I mean, I liked what I heard from the first selectman about trying to get to the 10, and I don't want to go in the other direction, for whatever reason it is. I want to go, you could talk to me about the slowing the increase up to the 10, but I'm not going to go in the other direction. I'm just not going to do, I mean, personally, I cannot do that under any circumstances.
Okay.
How long have we lived with the current rule the way it's been? How many years?
I would have no idea. Probably a very long time.
Well, if it means the difference between going backwards on that, getting closer to the 5, I'll wait another year on it, and we'll wait for another surplus. We had a great surplus this year. We've caught up on some other accounting issues. But if it's the difference between going backwards or going forwards on the amount, the 5% or getting closer to the edge, I'm not going below that or getting closer to it. We'll have to make it up in another year or budget for it. And if it can't be budgeted for, then, we'll figure it out.
Okay. Anybody else? Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, I mean, I fully understand your issues, your concerns, and your comments, Mr. Wallace and Mr. Brown's. I do not have a strong feeling on this issue. I think it would be nice if we could do it, but I also think it's, like everything else, it's my responsibility to bring these issues to the board.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Tetra? No, not at all. Not at all. No. I use all the help I can get.
And just to point out that in this past budget, we did put an amount in called a supplemental contribution to surplus.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
We did put in this past budget a line item for supplemental contribution to surplus to make sure that as the budget increases, we're also putting a number into surplus to make sure we're not falling behind on a percentage basis for what that is. That's a practice that I would plan on continuing in the years ahead. I mean, it should be part of our normal budgeting process to do that.
Yep, I agree. And actually, that's where I was going with, if we wanted to address this accounting change, I'm just saying, I'm laying it out there, you could actually increase this amount in the next budget cycle, and when we make the adjustment, you wouldn't be going backwards year over year, if we wanted to do it that way.
That would be one of the options, or because it seems we've had a number of one-time items that happen every year
Yeah.
in different categories.
Only since you've been there. Yeah.
Seems you led off with the two hurricanes in your, or Mr. Bolito's comments on your term. But however, I think that I might be cautious about planning any more than
Right.
that. We'll try and put in something that's reasonable to keep us ahead of the expense growth. And then if it's the board's wishes, we'll just plan to do this at another time when it's appropriate.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, just some round numbers, if we were to have a budget increase of 4%, 5%, that requires by itself to stay even with our current percentage would require a $600,000 to $750,000 contribution to surplus as a line item.
Thank you. Anybody else? Seeing none, I'm wondering whether we vote on this or we just let it, yeah.
I'm not even sure counting policy is purview of the board, but I thought it was appropriate to bring to the board.
No. Okay, so we'll go on to the next item, which is to hear an update on pension contributions. And this was the item that Mr. Mayor corrected me before, that I jumped ahead on. This was the entire discussion regarding what our return was. And you'll recall, and for the newer members of the board, during the last budget cycle, there was a revaluation, for lack of a better word, of many of the actuarial assumptions, which calculated what we needed to put into the pension funds for the town, okay, for the town police and fire. And out of that came an actual thought that we could reduce our pension contribution on a one-year basis and get to the actuarial determined amount that we needed to put in. This board, during the budget process last year, added, I think, $850,000 into the pension funds in a move that we called kind of hold harmless, do no harm, which was to keep our pension contribution flat year over year. So instead of actually going down, we remained flat. Well, as it turned out, when the year ended, the fiscal year ended June 30th, one of the assumptions as regarding rate of return was off for that one-year period. Now, let's be clear, it was a one-year period where the rate of return on the funds was it was lower than 1%, I think it was, where the estimates had been over a 30-year period a 7.75% return. Okay? So we knew that going into this year, there would be a discussion about the actuarial report. And you remember that that actuarial report was already showing a significant required increase in pension contribution for fiscal year 2014, right? So that significant contribution that would be required, or increase in contribution, was further exacerbated, that's the right word, by the fact that we didn't get the rate of return that we figured for that one-year period. Okay? So I worked with the first selectman and Mr. Mayor. I didn't work with them. I asked them if they could get us actuarial information earlier, and I thanked them for doing that, because I wanted to lay this on the table now so that everyone wouldn't have shock and awe in the budget cycle as to what the increased pension contribution would be. So that's why this was on here now. So, Mr. Mayor, with that, I'll turn that over to you. And thank you.
Yeah, and I think your recommendation and suggestion that we bring it up was the appropriate, and does help people get a general idea as we go March into budget season.
Or they can hear, I think.
Just move it.
Yeah, just, there you go.
Eat the mic.
All right, you have, does everybody have 18A and 18B?
Yes.
All right. 18A shows, oh yeah, I can even hear the difference. 18A shows the actual data for the fiscal years 2012, 2013 request and approved, and the actuarially calculated employer contribution for fiscal year 2014. As Mr. Flynn has pointed out, the budget and the ARC, which was the term at that time, for 2012 was $5,452,000 approximately. After the actuarial review of the assumptions, that ended up with a resultant reduction in the required contribution for 2013, and this board decided to do no harm, to quote Mr. Flynn, and they added $850,000 to the $4,631,000, ending up with the $5,436,414. The reason that Mr. Flynn has asked that this come up is to point out that the next column, which is that the actuarially calculated employer contribution for the next fiscal year, i.e. this coming budget year, is $9,120,000, or a $4 million jump, 1.75% of our total general fund expenditures approximately. And this is using that 9.10 is using the new discount rate of 7.50 with the new assumptions as well.
So that's a jump of 3.7 million, right?
Yes, sir. And then 18B then takes this information and, assuming the 7.5%, assuming the assumptions, this will change, but this is the best projection available at this time, shows you what the potential future actually calculated contribution requirements will be. As you can see, the following year, fiscal year 2015, it goes to 10.9 million. In 2016, 10.4, drops a little bit, 9.8, and then 18, 9, 10 million. So you see the big jump, and then you see the trend. And there's really not much more to say about it.
Right. Does anybody have any questions on this? Mr. Walsh?
How did the 7.5 compare to what the actual return the fund had on its investments? What was the actual return on the investments?
The actual return, and there's, I'm going to present this in a couple of ways. The direct answer to your question, I think the actual return was 1% or 1.5% or something like that. Okay, but looking at year-end results is not always the best way of looking. I remember Larry Miller, who was a big mutual fund guru, who outperformed S&P by 2 or 3% for like 20 years running or something like that, right? But if you looked at his results on a different year, 12-month basis, you don't realize this the same return. I mean, he didn't have the same result. Like if you'd taken his results on a February to January basis, he didn't outperform the S&P 20 years. And so even though our last fiscal year was only 1 point whatever %, I think it's important to also realize that if you look at our return periods for the period ended October 31, 2012, for the last 3 years on an annualized basis, the annual return was 8.59%. If you looked at the last 12 months, we're at 9%. And if you look at the fiscal year to date, we are at 4.27%. That's for, what's that, 4 months of the year. So on an annual basis, last fiscal year was not good, but I don't think that is indicative or fully defines what our results are.
No, but what it did was it did jack up a little bit
Yes.
the amount we have to put in based on the fact that that is our cutoff date.
Yes, it jacked up the amount,
Couple $100,000.
$200,000, yeah.
So we were
300,000
facing,
or
we
something.
knew this at the end of the
Right.
year, we were facing a funding
Right.
cliff, or
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. I
Yeah.
guess my point is, it's not the return that has made this difference. It is basically the $3.7 million difference. It is history and assumptions and amortization of prior losses and all those things that go into the
it didn't
actuarial
help, but it
calculation.
wasn't the driving factor.
Right. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So that's what we're facing. To start. And I think it's important, Mr. Tetra, is this going before the RTM as well? Are they going to be notified? I know they get our package. I believe they get our package. But is there any thought that this is going to be shown to them in advance as well? Or to their finance committee, or whatever would be the appropriate?
As part of the budget process, yes, but not at this time. We had, this was also pretty well talked about, I'm going to say last March 20th or thereabouts, when the actuary came before this board and showed the 5-year trend, which was the first time, I'm going to say any of us saw the 5-year trend. And it was a key discussion point at that time, and one of the topics, at least for a number of the folks, both on this board, Board of Selectmen, the RTM since then, has been this $4 million increase that we're going to face this year. So I'm going to say everybody's aware of that. I don't believe they've had a formal presentation on it outside the normal budget process.
We might just want to, send them these two documents just so that they can, alert them once again, or remind them. I just think it's important that they know as we go into it.
We can certainly make that happen. I think the
No, I mean, we can do it as well, maybe our clerk can do it, whatever's the best way to do that, but I just think it's important information. And thank you guys, gentlemen, for working with the actuaries and getting it earlier. I appreciate that.
I knew this was coming. What was the market indexes in the same period, like the S&P 500, or are we beating them, are we behind them, or we? And the figure you gave, was that a net figure with expenses?
Yeah, I
and all
believe
that?
there's some index comparisons that are given to this board on a quarterly basis along with the updates on that. So
Just curious.
I would suggest that
Yeah, I
perhaps
that
when you have
information,
those.
Mr. Chair.
What?
Yeah, I have that information.
Oh.
Yeah, the weighted benchmark for our 8.59% for the last 36 months is 8.34, so we beat it by 25 basis points. Last 12 months are 9% versus the benchmark of 8.10. We beat it by 90 basis points. And fiscal year to date are 4.27 versus our weighted benchmark 4.23. We've beat it by 4 basis points.
Okay. Any other questions, comments on this item? All right, there's no action to take. This was just a discussion point. I'm going to ask for a 2-minute break, and then we'll just come back, and if anybody wants to go through particulars and the follow-up items, we'll go through that quickly. Okay? Thanks. So, 2-minute break. Thank you. Welcome back. Item number 5 on our agenda is a follow-up item, and it's to review follow-up request documents. This is something that's going to be a standing item on our agenda, to review follow-up items from prior meetings, documentation received. Now, I will admit, however, this list of follow-up documents is quite lengthy because it encompasses many meetings. So, to be very candid, I have not had the opportunity to get through all of these documents because, Bob, there's probably like 50 or 60 of them, right? So I'll just open the floor for questions, comments, concerns on individual documents, if that's okay. We received these packages, I think, Friday, right? Friday, I think this was
It
distributed.
was Friday morning. You know what, I have to say, Caitlin and I, Ms. Boss and I, tried really, really hard to get this out a little sooner, but we failed, and I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. That wasn't a criticism, quite frankly. I thank you for all your efforts. You and your teams, actually, for putting this all together. And Mr. Tetra, I include you in that, so thank you for working to get these documents for us. So does anybody have any comments? Where would people like to start on the documents?
Just one.
Just one?
I get started on one.
Yeah, okay. So anybody?
All right. I have a question, I guess, in regards to one.
Okay, item number 1?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, the money to pay for Mr. Hiller's severance is basically just an overrun in the department. That's basically what you're saying, like any overrun. So we're just going to let the department overrun, and then you're going to do a transfer, kind of like the transfers we did tonight. Or, transfer from another department, or at a surplus, or someplace else later on.
That would be the normative way to handle the situation, yes, sir.
Okay. That's all the questions I have on number 1.
Okay. Next item.
Wait, are we going to do this
We can,
one by one, or are we jumping around?
no, we can jump around. Anyone have anything? Mr. Bolito,
Allow me to jump around, please. Thank you.
which item are you going to?
Where are we? I guess it would be number 7, which is the Rob Bolito issue, so I might as well handle that one myself here. More of a comment than anything. I'm not going to get into another legal back and forth on this. This was about the creation of the financial services manager position and whether it was violative of the town charter. I read the opinion. Frankly, again, I was not entirely convinced of it. It seems like kind of it's going to be a dead issue since the position's going to go away, but I did just want to make that point that in the future, these opinions need to be backed up by a little bit better case law. To say things are axiomatic in illegal opinions, it annoys me, frankly. That's not a proper way to put forth the legal opinion. You should have it backed up by case law. And if it's not on point, then it shouldn't be used. So I'll just make that statement and leave it alone. Thank you.
Okay.
Following up on Mr. Bolito's question on the same topic, we have it on your representation, Mr. Tetro, that position is going away June 30th, not to return to your knowledge in the future. Because that's the only way his legal opinion makes any sense. Either if his legal opinion is based on the fact that it's a short-term position, that it goes to June 30th. But I'd like for you to acknowledge, because that's the only way his legal opinion makes any sense at all, because otherwise it's a new position.
There is no plan to have that position after June 30th.
So it'll end and that position will just be terminated. Okay. Is there any plans to, right now, increase any positions in the finance department? As of the date you're sitting here right now?
When you talk the position, there will be a CFO position in the
Well,
next
yes.
budget in the finance department, correct?
Okay, but other than that, there's no, at least as you're sitting here today, no
We
plan
are,
on...
we are just getting into the budget process. I don't know of any position being planned for that.
Okay.
On that vein, with the exception of the CFO spot, are we fully staffed now in the finance area? Because there was a position added 2 years ago?
Yeah.
A year and a half ago? Are we fully staffed now? Are all positions?
We're fully staffed, but we are inadequately staffed to do things like grant accounting and some other things that would be really nifty.
So
Can you say that
sounds
louder?
like-
I couldn't hear what you said.
Yeah.
We are fully staffed with our complement. However, the full staff does not provide the finance department adequate resources to do like grant accounting and some other things that would be nifty to be able to do.
Okay. Mr. Walsh?
While we're on that same legal opinion, our counsel seems to suggest that we were correct, that we are the only ones who can touch our clerk, meaning hire, terminate, and set the salary for that position, whatever that is. And we're currently in the process through a specific committee that was set up to deal with that and then find a permanent clerk and to set that salary. And we have it on, based on that and based on this legal opinion, Mr. Tetro, you fully understand that, and we're not going to try to touch this in the future during your administration, correct?
This was something that came out of the negotiation with Mr. Hiller.
Hmm?
Mr. Flynn made it very clear how that was perceived by this board. Certainly didn't mean to do that, and I certainly concede that it is the purview of this board to hire, terminate, and set the salary for that position just as you laid out.
Yeah, because I think this board is very sensitive to that, because it was, he admits it in his legal opinion that it was a breach of the charter to even get in there. And what he doesn't address in his current legal opinion is whether, if Mr. Hiller, we did hire him right away, whether it would be a breach of the contract that you signed. I don't really want to beat a dead horse and get another legal opinion on that, but he doesn't address that. So
I thought the question was, could he be hired back? And I thought that was responded in the positive. So I think that should address that or comprehend that, but
I think legally he can be hired back, but I don't know whether it would be a breach of the contract itself, because there's a contractual term about it.
Does address it, actually.
Yeah, it says that their lawyer,
Yeah, on
that's
page,
from their lawyer, right?
yeah, Jim, on page 2 of 3 of the legal opinion, going over onto page 3, it says, nothing in the, and then turn the page, agreement prohibits Hiller from being employed as the clerk in the future. Accordingly, is our opinion, Hiller is eligible for rehire. So I'm taking that to mean that it doesn't violate the agreement. Would I be correct?
that would be my understanding also.
Yeah, what I'm saying is, it doesn't exactly address it. I understand, I read
It's a little
I read it too.
vague. It is a little vague.
It's a little vague,
Yeah.
but I think we get the point that we could hire Mr. Hiller back if it became our purview to do so. Thank you.
That's the way I read it, anyway. Anyone else? Can we, Mr. Brown,
On a
please.
different issue.
Yeah, feel free.
On number 13, on FEMA,
That's where I was going, yeah.
right, just, are there any updates on point 1 and point 2? On the consultant, on finances, on,
Excuse me. The first selectman put together a committee of Deputy Fire Chief Art Reed, DPW Director Joseph Michelangelo, and myself. We are holding interviews, which the first selectman has attended the first one as well. We have had one interview with one consultant group. We have another interview scheduled like tomorrow, I think. And we have another, and then we have another one scheduled a week from yesterday. And we may add one or two more to that. We hope to, then the three of us, Chief Reed, Director Michelangelo, and myself, will make a recommendation to the first selectman as to what the three of us think is appropriate going forward.
Mr. Brown, any follow-ups?
On number 2, how about the financial impact? You had preliminary numbers back on the 13th of November. Any update on the numbers?
No, we have some very rough numbers that we put together, but it's nothing definitive. I mean, like, for example, its ranges, like, for example, Penfield Pavilion, 500 to 999,000. So, yeah, but we hope to have more definitive numbers. People are aggressively working to produce the numbers that are, tighter ranges, more exacting.
Okay. Thank you.
One question I did have, if nobody has a follow-up specific to that, if I can ask mine. It's on the business interruption insurance. Just a quick one. The thing that did hit me was Penfield Pavilion. I know there were a bunch of events and things that had to be canceled there. Is that below the deductible for this?
No, we've actually realized about $28,142 worth of cancellations through May 10th, plus one in June.
Of next year?
Yes, sir. So, yeah, we will fully realize the $25,000 in coverage.
Through the business interruption insurance?
No, actually, no, through the rental income insurance.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it. Yes, I'm sorry. Okay, so we're good there. All right. And nothing else at Penfield? Nothing else?
No, and I tried with respect to business interruption, but the rule is there has to be a claim, there has to be an insurance claim in conjunction with business interruption. So there's no insurance claims at the recycling facility. There's no insurance claims at the golf course. So there's no business interruption coverage.
So there's got to be a damage claim.
There's got to be a damage claim above the
It's not just
deductible.
that you were wiped out for a period of days.
Right, because there's no coverage for downed trees and that type of thing.
How much are we paying for business interruption insurance then? I'm curious. I mean, if
I mean, it's,
yeah,
I have no idea.
yeah.
But I could find out. I mean,
We should
it's
just
a
kind of.
big policy with,
Yeah, no, I
several
understand.
pages of items.
I understand, but if we're paying for something that they're basically saying, yeah, unless it's a direct strike at 12:32, you have no chance. I mean, all right,
I will check on the incremental cost of that.
yeah. Mrs. Allen?
On another item,
Please.
number 8. I'll wait for people to get to 8.
By the way, the only criticism on this, it'd be great if the pages were numbered, actually. That's the only thing. Are they? I don't see them.
Not every day.
Somewhere. I don't know. I don't have that, actually. Yeah. Or maybe I do.
The only pages that aren't numbered are the PO pages.
Maybe. I'm not seeing it. Oh, some are, some aren't. Okay. What page? 8?
Number 8.
Number
There you go.
Legal Services, 2011-12 final.
Yeah.
Would it be possible, not tonight, but at a future date, to see by firm what type of specialty they may have been providing the town, what type of work they were doing? Some of these we can look at and assume, in the case of the town attorney, there's a broad range of things they do. But some of these firms, as you look at them, and there's some larger numbers, they might be one-time services they would have provided us, but, or is it an indicator that we have, a lot of legal needs in a certain area in town as far as litigation of some sort, or just some of these services are, I'm sure, for contract negotiations, but you have to look here and sort of guess.
And I would like to follow up the exact same thing, except because I don't think that this was really responsive to what the request was. The request was, and I think I made it, was that we've had a cost overrun in the legal services department by over 50%. And the analysis I was looking for was not what dollars we paid to firms, but what were the drivers? I mean, it's one of Mike's terms. What were the drivers that led us to go over in that budget? What projects came up that we didn't know about? What litigation came up that we didn't know about? What extra legal work came up that we did not budget for? So I'm looking for you to go back and figure that out, to tell us what areas we went over on. Was it the Metro Center, because of ongoing problems or litigation or whatever? Was it litigation that we budgeted a certain amount for? I presume that when our town attorney gives us our budget and comes before us, that when he gives us a budget, he's not just saying, oh, I'll take last year's number and add 5% to it. I presume that there's this much for litigation, this much for tax appeal. I mean, obviously, tax appeals was a big thing. We went with a new firm and we went with a new process. But that's what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for who got paid the money on the overrun. I was looking for us to be able to analyze how we went over and what areas we went over so we could learn. And also, maybe we're not budgeting enough in legal services. And through this analysis, we can show the RTM, who cut back more on that, why we need to budget more, or how to justify next year's budget because we're seeing an uptick in this area of the law. So I think with a budget that's, that's a recurring budget of this size, to see a 50% overrun, something happened last year. Some of us know here on, certain areas that we went over on. Mr. Tetro? Mike wants to talk.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you want to do that as a separate step here? Would you like to see that included as part of the budget presentation in the legal department, which would then tie it out to next year's budget at the same time?
Let me jump in for a couple things, because I actually don't think, we may not be that far apart. Number one, I think definitely as part of the legal budget presentation, what we're going to have going forward, that'd always be helpful. Secondly, I do think in prior meetings, if I recall, we actually did have schedules. Ms. Bossi, I don't know if you were involved in creating them, but we did actually have schedules. Do you recall them? And Mr. Walsh, it predates your time on the board, and Mrs. Albin as well, where they had the law firms listed on the left-hand side, I think. Right. And then case matter, or maybe even not case matters, but it's an Excel spreadsheet that basically said this was litigation, this was tax appeals, this was Metro Center. Exactly. So I've seen a schedule like that before.
Okay. Well, then we'll either go back and find it and put it together in that format or create it so it answers that question.
Yeah, because we did have it before, and that is actually what I was expecting this time. Yeah. So it's just the same thing. I think probably 60 to 70% of the work might already be done. Do you remember it as well? Yeah. So if we could
Well,
do
I think
that.
because, at least in some of the primary firms, they really only do one function
Right.
for us.
Mhm.
So we know that Cohen and Wolf is primarily the tax appeals. We know that McCarter and English was some of the follow-up on the Metro station. We know that
Right.
McHale is primarily the labor contract
Negotiations.
negotiation.
Yeah.
But we can flesh that out so it's a more complete answer.
Yeah, I think it would just give us a better baseline going forward next time we have a tax appeal. How much did it cost us last time?
And I think actually if we could use this, if we could decide on the same format that you could also use for the budget, that you could also use for that, that way we can just, if we have an issue again, we can just track it, and it's a schedule we're all used to seeing. So
That
that'd be
works.
great. Thank you.
We'll do that.
What else?
So are we going to have that, just so that we're clear about that, is that going to be produced at a certain time, or,
Mr. Mayor,
just for
Mrs.
for
Bossi,
Jim's
yeah.
purposes?
When do you guys think you could produce the schedule that looks back? Not the budget one, obviously, that's Mr. Lesser, but when do you think you can produce the one that looks back?
The one that you were referring to? The
Exactly.
I think Linda Gardner might have that one.
All right, can you follow up with me tomorrow and then report back, how long it could be? Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Any other questions?
I have some.
Sure, Mr. Walsh, go right ahead.
I saw the copies of the legal bills from Bircham Moses and from Stanton Lesser that were produced, and I appreciate those being produced. We had talked about having a roll forward, like a kind of a worksheet on this whole Hiller thing to find out what the costs were, because we knew that they were going to be going up.
Yeah.
And we never seemed to have that, and I think it's time to start preparing that. Because obviously, some of those bills, especially, there was a legal opinion that was prepared for tonight's meeting that are not in there, because that's not contained in the Burcham Moses bill and things like that. But I think it's time, at least we produce it so that we can keep track of these costs as they go forward. We had talked about doing that, and it just came to mind when I read through some of those materials.
So basically a summary financial document of what that settlement and where we are now.
Yeah.
Which should be pretty easy since we know what I guess we have a lot more information now than we did like 3 months ago, right? Do we know, if I can ask, what's the status of Mr. Hiller after December 31st? What happens after that?
I don't have an update on that.
So he might still continue to work a couple days a week? Is that so you guys are working that out over the next couple of weeks, I would imagine? Okay. All right. Thank you.
I'm glad you brought that. That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry.
Well, we talked about it, Mr. Tetra talking to Mr. Hiller about what his intentions were and whether, because one of those meetings where we were asking for these documents,
Right.
we had requested whether you thought he might be going at the end of the year, the 31st of December, you weren't sure, but you were going to check with him to see what his intent was.
We'll be happy to do that.
Okay.
Right. Go ahead.
This detailed P&O report schedules A and E, I just have a couple questions in regards to some of these. Can you explain to me exactly what these are for again? Because I don't have those schedules right in front of me. These were POs that were kept open, that we were requesting to stay opened, even though the money we have purchase orders and we just haven't expended the money?
We had not received the goods or services by June 30th.
So these are,
Budgeted and they were included in their budget.
so we want to keep some of this stuff open, correct?
They probably have been closed by now.
Oh, really? Okay. So some of these are, okay. Well, let me just take a look at, could we get some list of what's been closed out? Because I guess my questions, I was going to ask questions about specific ones because I went through the report, but it doesn't seem to make sense if we've already spent it. Correct?
I don't know how much we
Because
spent.
it doesn't really matter at that point.
No.
Okay. So could we get a new list for the next meeting to see what's still open?
Of these
Yes.
particular ones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we could ask questions about those, of why they're still open.
Okay.
Anything else?
In regards to the business interruption insurance, I just want to confirm, I presume, I heard Mr. Mayor, what you said about the actual claim, the insurance claim. So I presume that if your business is closed because you don't have insurance, we're not covered for any of it, correct?
If your business is closed and you
Your
don't
business
have
is
them-
interrupted because you don't have electricity, that's not a
That's not a
compensable
covered-
claim.
Correct, it's correct.
Okay. I think it would be good for risk management is now Eileen Kennelly during the budget season to explain to her what situations and the reason why we get business interruption insurance, because based on what just happened to our town and the fact that we really can't recover for any of it, you start asking the question about what would be covered. So it might make sense if she can explain to us why we have it, how much it costs, and the reasons why we should have it. Yep.
Yeah, Mr. Tetra.
I think in light of the earlier question, in terms of kind of doing the cost value on that, make sure if it's just, I don't know how much that incrementally costs. I think we need to know that, and then to get any additional coverage, if that's possible, what would be involved in that, so we can see what that is.
Thank you. You can stay there if you'd like, Mr. Tetra.
It's getting a workout.
Those are all the questions I have.
Anybody else? Seeing none, we're going to go on to the last item on our agenda, which is to hear, consider, and act upon any communication. The only item I wanted to make you all aware of is, I believe it's December 11th, the Board of Education has a meeting, and I don't usually call out Board of Education meetings, but I believe they're going to hear, they're starting their budget process in earnest within their department. And on December 11th, I believe it is, which is that Tuesday, they're going to hear a discussion and a presentation from Aon regarding their medical insurance. And that's going to be a significant discussion and is potentially a significant driver of their financial condition for the next fiscal year. And of course, the town and the Board of Ed are completely intertwined as it relates to the internal service fund and what happens with those accounts. So that's December 11th, and I believe that meeting's right here. And so I wanted to let everybody know, and if you can make it, feel free. And it'll be live on Fair TV and other outlets as well. All right, any other questions, comments, concerns? Any other, Ms. Bossi, Mrs. Bossi, any other communications for the board?
No.
All right, I thank everybody for their time and attention. Do I have a motion? Mr. Stone, do I have a second? Mr. Bolito, all in favor of adjournment? All opposed? Thank you, everybody. And if I failed to say it, enjoy the holidays.
Yeah. This is just, throw it away.